What if the story of David and Goliath is not really about David? We have been told since childhood that it is a tale of courage, a small shepherd, a giant warrior, faith against fear. It fits neatly on a Sunday school wall. It fits inside a children's book, but stand for a moment in the Valley of Elah. Feel the dry wind move through the terebinth trees. Hear the bronze armor shift on the body of a man who stands nearly 10 feet tall. Look at the ranks of Israel trembling under King Saul's command. This is not a children's tale. This is a collision between civilizations. Goliath of Gath was not just a big man with a spear. He was the living symbol of Philistine dominance. A champion from one of the 5 cities, Gath, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Ekron, and Gaza. A remnant of something older, something that traces back through the Anakim, through Numbers and Deuteronomy, into whispers of ancient giants that Genesis barely explains. And when he stepped forward for 40 days, morning and evening, and defied the armies of Israel, he was not only mocking Saul, he was challenging the God of Sinai. The book of 1 Samuel gives us the scene, but the shadow of Goliath stretches far beyond it, into the memory of Joshua's conquests, into the warnings of Moses, even into the language Jude and 2 Peter later use when speaking of rebellion that crosses boundaries set by God. The giant in the valley is not the beginning of the story. He is the echo of something unfinished. Tonight we step back before the Sling stone flies, before David's name is sung in Jerusalem, before the monarchy stabilizes. We begin with Gath, because to understand the boy you must first understand the giant. Long before a shepherd from Bethlehem stepped into the Valley of Elah, there was a city that shaped the man he would face. Gath, not Jerusalem, not Bethlehem, not even Hebron where Abraham once walked. Gath stood on the western edge of the Judean foothills, near the borderlands where Israel's tribal territory blurred into Philistine strength. Today archaeologists call the mound Tel Safi. In the Iron Age it was a fortress city. Thick walls, massive gates, storage complexes, workshops, a place built not just to survive, but to dominate. The Philistines were not native Canaanites. Their origins trace back across the Mediterranean, likely from the Aegean world. Egyptian records from the reign of Ramesses III speak of the Sea Peoples, who swept across coastal regions around the 12th century before Christ. Among them were the Peliset, almost certainly the Philistines. They brought something Israel did not have: iron. While the tribes of Israel were still relying on bronze and agrarian tools, Philistine smiths were forging stronger weapons. 1 Samuel later notes that Israel had to go down to Philistine towns just to sharpen their plowshares and axes. Think about that. The covenant people of Sinai depending on their enemies to maintain their tools. Now imagine standing in Gath's marketplace, traders moving between Ashkelon and Ekron, soldiers drilling in the courtyard, priests offering sacrifices to Dagon, the fish god whose temple would later collapse in Samson's final act in Gaza. This was not a primitive culture. It was organized, confident, technologically advanced, and within its walls something older lingered. The Hebrew scriptures speak of the Anakim. In Numbers, when the spies sent by Moses entered Canaan, they returned terrified. They described the sons of Anak in Hebron. "We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes," they said. That line stayed with Israel. It exposed more than fear. It revealed perspective. Deuteronomy recalls these giants again. Moses mentions the Rephaim in Bashan under King Og, whose bedstead was said to be enormous. These were not fairy tales in Israel's memory. They were historical threats tied to specific places: Ashtaroth, Edrei, Hebron. Joshua later records that while much of the Anakim were driven out during the conquest, some remained in Gaza, Ashdod, and Gath. Gath becomes a refuge for remnants. That matters, because Goliath is not described simply as tall. He is called a man of the in-between, a champion. The Hebrew word suggests one who steps between armies as representative. But his height, 6 cubits and a span, places him in continuity with that earlier memory of giants. Now pause for a moment Imagine being an Israelite soldier who grew up hearing the stories of the wilderness generation, the fear at Kadesh Barnea, the refusal to enter the land because of the sons of Anak, the 40 years of wandering that followed. And now, generations later, a giant from Gath stands before you, history repeating itself, the past unresolved. Jewish tradition never entirely forgot these connections. Later rabbinic writings would treat Goliath not merely as a big warrior, but as a descendant of ancient rebellion. The Targums, Aramaic paraphrases of the Hebrew Bible, sometimes amplified these lineages, tying giant clans to earlier corruption described in Genesis 6, the strange episode of the Nephilim before the flood. Even in the New Testament, brief but charged references in Jude and 2 Peter recall a time when boundaries between heaven and earth were crossed improperly. They speak of rebellion that distorted creation itself. Those texts do not mention Goliath by name, but they keep alive the idea that certain defiant powers have deep roots. So Gath was not just another Philistine city. It was a stronghold of memory, a place where unfinished battles from Joshua's day still breathed. Inside those walls, a boy could grow into a weapon trained from youth, conditioned for war, surrounded by a culture that valued strength, spectacle, and intimidation. Goliath did not emerge from nowhere. He was shaped by Gath's pride, and Gath stood as a challenge to Israel's calling, because Israel was never meant to win by iron. From Sinai onward, their identity rested on covenant, on the voice that thundered from the mountain, on a law that demanded justice and exclusive loyalty to Yahweh. They were a people set apart, not because they were larger or stronger, but because they were chosen. That difference is fragile, and along the borderlands, fragility shows. In the days leading up to the Valley of Elah, Philistine power was expanding eastward. Their pentapolis Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath operated as a loose confederation. They controlled trade routes along the Via Maris. They had chariots, professional soldiers, political coordination. Israel, by contrast, was still a patchwork of tribes. The monarchy under Saul was young. The memory of judges like Gideon and Samson was recent and uneven. Gath looked stable. Israel looked uncertain. And when civilizations collide, the strongest symbol often steps forward first. From the gates of Gath, that symbol would soon walk into the valley, not just as a soldier, but as a statement. Gath did not rise by accident. Its location was strategic. It sat near the border between the coastal plain and the hill country of Judah. Whoever controlled Gath could pressure Israel's heartland while still maintaining access to Mediterranean trade. It was both shield and spear for Philistia. Excavations at Tel E Safi have uncovered massive fortification systems, walls nearly 12 feet thick in some sections. That is not the architecture of a weak people. That is a city expecting conflict. Storage jars stamped with distinctive markings suggest organized supply chains. Imported pottery reflects Aegean influence. Even dietary remains, pig bones in abundance, distinguished Philistine culture sharply from Israelite communities nearby. Two worlds side by side. One shaped by covenant law in places like Shiloh, where the tabernacle once stood. The other shaped by maritime networks, trade alliances, and warrior prestige. Now consider what it means to grow up in Gath as a child who is noticeably different, larger, stronger, marked by unusual size from early youth. In a culture that prized physical dominance, such a child would not be hidden. He would be cultivated. Ancient societies often turned exceptional bodies into public symbols. In Egypt, physical anomalies were sometimes treated as divine signs. In Mesopotamia, royal inscriptions boasted exaggerated strength and height. Assyrian kings like Ashurnasirpal II carved reliefs showing themselves towering over enemies, even if the proportions were artistic rather than literal. But Goliath's case feels different. The biblical text lingers on his armor, bronze helmet, coat of mail weighing 5,000 shekels, greaves on his legs, a javelin slung between his shoulders, the shaft of his spear compared to a weaver's beam. the iron point alone weighing 600 shekels. These are not mythic numbers tossed casually. They are meant to overwhelm the imagination. The emphasis on iron is deliberate. Israel during Saul's reign lacked blacksmiths. 1 Samuel notes plainly that the Philistines controlled iron production so tightly that Israelite farmers had to travel into Philistine territory to sharpen tools. On the day of battle, only Saul and Jonathan are said to have swords. Let that settle. An army standing against a fully armed champion with farm tools. This was not just a mismatch of height. It was a technological gap, and Gath embodied it. There is something psychologically crushing about facing an enemy who represents not only physical strength but systemic superiority. Better weapons, better organization, better infrastructure. Goliath was the visible tip of a deeper imbalance. Yet Scripture places Goliath in continuity with the Anakim. That link is quiet but powerful. In Joshua, after much of the land is subdued, the text says the Anakim were cut off from the hill country, but some remained in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. Why preserve that detail? Because it means the conquest under Joshua was not total in the way people expected. The land was entered, cities fell, Jericho's walls collapsed, Hazor burned, but pockets remained, threads of resistance. History rarely ends cleanly, and unresolved threats tend to resurface at moments of weakness. Jewish historian Josephus, writing in the 1st century, recounts the story of Goliath with emphasis on his extraordinary size, reinforcing the ancient memory that certain clans were known for unusual stature. He does not treat the giant as fantasy. He treats him as historical anomaly. Early Christian writers followed that pattern. They read Goliath as real yet symbolic. Augustine would later see in him an image of pride, human arrogance magnified. But even Augustine did not strip away the historical grounding. The giant was flesh and bone. Now widen the lens. The Philistines were not only Israel's military rivals, they were cultural competitors. They worshipped Dagon, whose temple in Ashdod would later house the captured Ark of the Covenant. They had priests, rituals, sacred spaces. They interpreted power differently. When the Ark was captured in battle during the days of Eli, it was taken first to Ashdod, then to Gath. Think about that connection. The same city that raised Goliath once held Israel's most sacred object within its borders. That episode in 1 Samuel 5 describes Dagon's statue falling face down before the Ark twice, as if bowing. The message is subtle but clear. Power confronts power. Gath had already witnessed humiliation at the hands of Israel's God, but humiliation does not always produce humility. Sometimes it produces defiance. By the time Goliath steps into the Valley of Elah, decades may have passed since the Ark incident. Memory fades, pride returns, a new generation grows, and among them stands a champion. His very presence revives old anxieties in Israel. The spies report in numbers echoes across centuries. We seemed like grasshoppers. That phrase describes internal perception more than external reality. Fear magnifies the enemy, but something else is happening beneath the surface. In Deuteronomy, Moses warned Israel that when they entered the land, they must not attribute victory to their own strength. It is not because of your righteousness, he said. It is because of the wickedness of these nations. The land was gift, not achievement. Now Israel stands in that land, facing a giant from a city Joshua never fully subdued. The theological tension tightens. If God gave the land, why does a giant still stand on its soil? If the conquest was promised, why does Gath still flourish? These are not abstract questions. They hang in the air long before David arrives. And in Gath, training continues. Weapons sharpened, armor fitted, voices teaching young warriors the stories of Philistine resilience, stories of Samson captured, stories of Israel divided, stories of Saul's early victories now fading into uncertainty. Civilizations remember differently. Israel remembered Sinai. Gath remembered survival. And survival breeds hard confidence. Soon, that confidence will step into open space between two ridgelines, not just to fight, but to test whether Israel still believes its own story. By the time Goliath left the gates of Gath and marched east toward the Valley of Elah, he was more than a soldier. He was a message. The Philistine strategy was not random aggression. It was pressure, gradual expansion into the Rephaim, the lowland hills that formed a buffer between the coastal plain and the Judean highlands. Towns like Soko and Azekah sat along that corridor. Control them and you threaten Bethlehem. Push further and Jerusalem itself becomes vulnerable. The Valley of Elah was not chosen for drama. It was chosen for terrain. Two ridges facing each other, a dry streambed cutting between them. Open ground wide enough for formations but narrow enough to prevent flanking maneuvers. A natural stage. The Philistines gathered on one slope. Israel assembled opposite, and from Gath came the champion. The Hebrew word used in 1 Samuel is Ish HaBainim, literally the man of the middle, the one who stands between. In ancient Near Eastern warfare, this was not unusual. Instead of full-scale slaughter, two armies could allow representatives to fight. The outcome would decide the battle. It sounds efficient, but it is also psychological warfare, because the representative carries the honor of his people. His defeat means humiliation. His victory means dominance. Goliath's armor gleamed in the sun, bronze catching light, iron spearhead heavy and deliberate. A shield-bearer walked before him, emphasizing his status. He did not rush. He descended into the valley slowly, and then he spoke. His words are often remembered as mockery, but listen closely. Choose a man for yourselves. Not for Saul, not for Yahweh, for yourselves. He frames Israel as self-reliant, self-defined, cut off from divine identity. Then he says, I defy the ranks of Israel this day. The defiance is not casual insult. The Hebrew carries the weight of reproach, scorn directed at the covenant community. In the ancient world, to insult an army was to insult its God. Goliath was not simply challenging Saul. He was challenging the God who brought Israel out of Egypt. Now step back and feel the scale widen. This is no longer Gath versus Bethlehem. It is Dagon's world against the memory of Sinai. It is iron against promise. It is the question of whether Israel's God still acts in history, or whether Philistine steel now rules the land. 40 days, morning and evening, Goliath came forward. 40 is not random in Scripture. 40 years in the wilderness. 40 days Moses on Sinai. 40 days Elijah walking to Horeb. 40 days of rain in Genesis. The number marks testing, exposure, refining or revealing. For 40 days, Israel's fear is exposed. Saul stands head and shoulders above other Israelites, according to earlier description in 1 Samuel, physically impressive, kingly in stature. The people once saw him and felt reassured. Now he remains silent. The king who was chosen partly for appearance is paralyzed before a greater appearance. Here lies the first deep fracture in Israel's monarchy. Saul's authority had already begun to crack. In Gilgal, he offered sacrifice without waiting for Samuel. Later, he spared King Agag of Amalek against divine command. Samuel's rebuke was sharp. Obedience is better than sacrifice. The kingdom would be torn from him. That tearing is not yet visible on the battlefield, but it hangs over the valley like heat. Meanwhile, in Gath, Goliath likely assumed inevitability. He had been trained for this moment. His size alone would intimidate. His armor created distance. His spear could pierce before a sword came close. From a purely human standpoint, he was unbeatable, and that is precisely the point. The biblical narrative is not interested in balanced odds. It sets the stage for impossibility. Yet the impossibility is not only physical, it is theological. Back in Deuteronomy, Moses warned Israel not to fear nations greater and taller than themselves. He specifically mentioned the Anakim, a people great and tall. But he reminded them that the Lord goes before them as a consuming fire. Joshua had seen giants fall before, but Joshua is gone. A generation has passed, and collective memory weakens under pressure. Now consider something else. When the ark was taken to Gath decades earlier, plague struck the city. Tumors broke out among the people, panic spread. The Philistines moved the ark from Ashdod to Gath to Ekron, trying to escape judgment. Eventually, they returned it on a cart pulled by cows. Gath knew something of Israel's God, but knowledge does not equal submission. Civilizations often compartmentalize humiliation. They absorb it, reframe it, move forward, and so Gath trained its champion. Not fearing Sinai, not fearing covenant, trusting iron. As the sun rose and set over the Valley of Elah, Goliath's voice echoed between ridges, each taunt carved deeper into Israel's morale. Soldiers likely avoided eye contact. Conversations quieted when he stepped forward. Imagine standing there, dust under your sandals, sweat gathering beneath your helmet, hearing the giant's challenge again, and no one moves. Fear does not always scream. Sometimes it settles in the stomach like stone. This is the moment before the story most people remember, before David arrives with bread and cheese for his brothers, before the sling is even mentioned. The narrative tension is thick because nothing has happened yet, but everything is at stake. Gath has sent its strongest. Israel waits for someone to believe its own history, and somewhere in Bethlehem, a shepherd tends sheep, unaware that the unfinished business of giants is about to collide with him. Before David ever stepped into the Valley of Elah, before Goliath's shadow stretched across the dry stream bed, there was already a deeper crisis unfolding in Israel. The crisis was not military, it was royal. Saul, son of Kish, came from the tribe of Benjamin, a small tribe, nearly erased once in the civil war described in Judges. From Gibeah, a town already stained by violence in Israel's memory. Read the final chapters of Judges, you find that Gibeah was the setting of brutality that nearly tore the tribes apart. And now Israel's first king rises from that soil. When Saul is introduced in 1 Samuel, he is described as impressive, taller than any of the people, handsome, the kind of figure who looks like a king should look. The people had asked Samuel for a king like the nations. They wanted visible strength, stability, someone to stand before them in battle. Samuel warned them. He spoke at Ramah, his hometown. He told them a king would tax their fields, take their sons, conscript their daughters, and centralize power. But the elders insisted. They were tired of the cycle of judges, tired of Midianite raids, tired of Philistine pressure. They wanted predictability. So Saul was anointed in secret by Samuel, oil poured on his head, a sign that God had set him apart. Later at Mizpah, the public selection took place. When Saul was chosen by Lot, he was found hiding among the baggage. Pause there. The first king of Israel hiding. It is a small detail, easy to overlook, but it reveals something fragile inside him, a hesitation, a reluctance that feels less like humility and more like fear of exposure. At first, Saul shows courage. In Jabesh-Gilead, when the Ammonite king Nahash threatens to gouge out the right eyes of the inhabitants, Saul rallies Israel. The Spirit of God rushes upon him. He defeats the Ammonites decisively. The people rejoice. Samuel renews the kingdom at Gilgal. For a moment, hope stabilizes, but beneath the surface, Saul is struggling. In 1 Samuel 13, facing Philistine forces at Michmash, Saul grows impatient waiting for Samuel. The prophet had instructed him to wait 7 days. Saul sees his troops scattering. Fear spreads, so he offers the burnt offering himself. It seems small, practical even, but it crosses a boundary. In Israel's structure, kings were not priests. Sacrifice was not a tool to manipulate divine favor. It was an act of obedience. Samuel arrives as the smoke rises. His words are sharp. You have not kept the command of the Lord. He tells Saul that his kingdom will not endure, that God has sought a man after his own heart. From that moment, the fracture begins. Saul still sits on the throne. He still commands armies, but the stability is gone. In 1 Samuel 15, the crisis deepens. Saul is commanded to strike Amalek, an ancient enemy dating back to Exodus when Amalek attacked Israel in the wilderness. The command is severe, total destruction. Modern readers wrestle with that. Ancient readers understood it within the framework of holy war, a judgment against persistent violence. Amalek represented generational hostility. Saul defeats them but spares King Agag. He also keeps the best livestock. He frames it as devotion, animals to sacrifice to the Lord. Samuel does not accept the explanation. Obedience is better than sacrifice. That line cuts through history. Saul's pattern is clear now. He adjusts commands to preserve appearances. He wants to look faithful. He wants to keep control. And Samuel speaks the final blow. The Lord has torn the kingdom from you. Think about what that means as Goliath later stands in the valley. The man wearing Israel's crown has already been rejected by God. Publicly, nothing changes. Privately, everything has. The spirit that once rushed upon Saul begins to withdraw. The text describes a troubling spirit tormenting him. Whether psychological, spiritual, or both, the effect is clear. Saul becomes unstable, suspicious, reactive. Meanwhile, Philistine pressure grows. At Michmash, Jonathan, Saul's son, had once taken initiative. Climbing a rocky crag with his armor-bearer, he attacked a Philistine outpost. He said something remarkable: "Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few." Jonathan understood something his father was beginning to forget. Victory was never about numbers. Now shift back to the Valley of Elah. When Goliath steps forward, Saul should have been the one to answer. He is the tallest man in Israel, the anointed king, the military leader. By ancient standards, the king often served as champion. Think of the kings of Assyria who personally led campaigns. Think of Pharaoh at Kadesh. Saul fits the physical description, but he does not move. The silence is deafening. Imagine the camp at night, fires burning low, soldiers whispering, the king's tent closed, armor unused. Leadership paralysis spreads faster than fear. Israel did not simply lack a volunteer. They lacked confidence in the one meant to represent them. And that is the deeper issue. The request for a king like the nations has come full circle. They wanted someone who looked strong. Now they face a nation whose strength is visible in iron and giants. Saul stands between two identities: chosen by God, desired by the people, rejected by the prophet, afraid of exposure. Goliath's challenge is not random timing. It exposes the hollow center of Israel's monarchy, and the valley waits. When fear settles into leadership, it does not stay contained. It seeps outward. Saul's court in Gibeah should have been a place of clarity, decisions made, strategy formed, priests consulted. Instead, what we begin to see in the chapters leading up to the Valley of Elah is fragmentation. The capital itself tells a story. Gibeah was not Jerusalem. It was not Hebron with its patriarchal weight. It was a modest hill town in Benjamin's territory. Archaeology suggests fortifications, yes, but nothing like the scale of Philistine cities along the coast. Saul's monarchy was young, improvised, still learning what it meant to centralize tribes that had long operated independently, and tribal memory runs deep. Ephraim does not easily submit to Benjamin. Judah watches carefully. The northern tribes calculate. Unity in Israel was always fragile, bound more by shared covenant than by bureaucratic structure. When Samuel anointed Saul, he did so under divine instruction. But Samuel also knew something the people did not. The monarchy was concession, not ideal. In the book of Deuteronomy, there is provision for a king, but the king must write his own copy of the law. He must not multiply horses. He must not multiply wives. He must not exalt himself above his brothers. The king is meant to kneel before Torah. Saul's problem was not lack of ability. It was internal instability. He feared losing control more than he feared disobedience. After Samuel's rebuke in Gilgal and again after Amalek, Saul begins to cling. He asks Samuel to honor him before the elders. He tears at Samuel's robe. The prophet turns and says the kingdom has been torn from him. That image lingers. A garment ripped, authority unraveling. Meanwhile, something else is happening quietly in Bethlehem. Samuel, grieving over Saul, is told by God to fill his horn with oil and go to the house of Jesse. There among 8 sons, the youngest, a shepherd, is chosen. The Spirit rushes upon David from that day forward, and the Spirit departs from Saul. The text presents this transition with almost surgical simplicity. No dramatic overthrow, no immediate coronation, just a shift in divine favor. Now imagine Saul's inner world. He knows something is wrong. He senses distance from God. His decisions feel heavier, his temper shorter. The troubling spirit mentioned in 1 Samuel does not necessarily mean possession as modern readers imagine. It speaks of agitation, oppression, disturbance. Music is brought in to soothe him. And who plays the harp? David of Bethlehem. Before David ever faces Goliath, he stands in Saul's court. He watches the king's mood swings. He sees insecurity up close. He understands what happens when leadership fractures. The irony is almost unbearable. The future king calming the rejected one. Now return to the Valley of Elah. When Goliath issues his challenge for 40 days, Saul hears it every time, morning and evening. The same rhythm as Israel's daily offerings at the tabernacle, the same rhythm as prayer. It is as if the Philistine taunt replaces liturgy. Morning, defiance. Evening, humiliation, 40 days of that. In ancient Israel, 40 often marked transition. Testing in the wilderness shaped a generation. Elijah's 40-day journey reshaped a prophet. Here, 40 days expose a king. But the exposure is not public spectacle. It is silent erosion. Saul's armor remains polished, his spear nearby, yet he cannot step forward. Perhaps he calculates the odds. Perhaps he sees Goliath's height and remembers the stories of the Anakim. Perhaps he knows deep down that the Spirit no longer rests upon him with power, and fear grows louder when faith grows thin. There is another layer here. In Israel's story, kings were meant to embody trust in God. When Moses stood before Pharaoh, he did not rely on chariots. When Joshua marched around Jericho, it was priests with trumpets, not siege engines, that led the way. The pattern was clear: obedience before strategy. Saul reverses that pattern. He calculates before he obeys. And now he stands facing a giant who embodies everything Israel feared when they first entered the land. This is the first major pivot in the story. We often think Goliath represents physical intimidation. But in truth, Goliath exposes spiritual drift. Israel had wanted a king like the nations. Now they face a nation whose strength outshines their own. Their solution has not saved them. The monarchy intended to stabilize Israel is cracking under pressure. And here is the deeper tension. If Saul falls in battle, Israel collapses. If he refuses to fight, morale collapses. Either path feels catastrophic. The king is trapped. And when leaders are trapped, entire nations feel it. Look again at the ridges of Elah. Sako behind the Philistines. Azekah near their camp. On Israel's side, the road leading back toward Bethlehem and the hill country of Judah. Farmers, shepherds, families. The stakes are not abstract. If Philistine control pushes further east, Israel loses autonomy. Trade routes fall under foreign authority. Cultural pressure intensifies. Worship at Shiloh becomes vulnerable. The covenant identity itself begins to erode. Goliath's voice is not just echoing in a valley. It is pressing against Israel's future. And Saul, chosen, anointed, fractured, remains still. The throne looks stable from a distance. Up close it trembles. There is a moment in every collapsing structure when it still looks intact. Walls standing, banners flying, armor polished, but the foundation has shifted. That is where Saul stands as Goliath's voice rolls across the Valley of Elah. The army is assembled. The tribal banners are raised. Men from Judah, Benjamin, Ephraim, and beyond line the ridge. On paper, Israel has what it asked for decades earlier, a king to lead them into battle, but something is off. The text in 1 Samuel says plainly, when Saul and all Israel heard the words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Notice the order: Saul first, then all Israel. Leadership sets the emotional climate. If the king had stepped forward once, just once, the story may have unfolded differently. Even defeat can rally courage, but paralysis breeds paralysis. Soldiers read silence quickly. They watch their king. They measure his posture, and Saul does not move. This is the second pivot in the narrative, though it happens quietly. Goliath is not merely a threat from outside Israel. He is a mirror. He reflects the kind of king Israel thought it needed: tall, imposing, armed. Saul once fit that image. When he stood among the people at Mizpah, he towered over them. His appearance reassured a nation anxious for visible strength. Now a taller figure stands in the valley. And Saul shrinks. The comparison is brutal. The people had chosen according to sight. God had warned them through Samuel. Now sight betrays them. There is a deeper theological current moving here. In Deuteronomy, Moses warned Israel not to say in their hearts, "My power and the might of my hand have got me this wealth." The covenant always carried this warning. Visible strength can deceive you. It can seduce you into thinking security lies in human scale. Saul's kingship was built partly on visible scale. Now that scale is outmatched, and fear rises. Imagine the camp conversations at night, men speaking in low tones. Has the prophet said anything? Will the king fight? Perhaps the Lord has abandoned us. Rumors travel quickly when hope fades, and somewhere in Saul's tent the king likely replays past moments in his mind. Gilgal, Amalek, Samuel's torn robe, the haunting words, "The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart." Saul knows something others do not. He knows the throne is no longer secure in heaven, even if it still stands on earth. That knowledge can hollow a man. It can make him hesitate at the very moment boldness is required. Meanwhile, the Philistine camp operates with clarity. Goliath steps forward each day with ritual precision. Morning, evening, 40 days, it becomes theater, psychological warfare perfected. In the ancient Near East, battles were not only physical confrontations, they were statements of divine favor. When Assyrian kings carved reliefs of conquered cities, they credited their god Ashur. When Egyptian pharaohs recorded victories, they praised Amun-Ra. Victory meant your god was stronger. Defeat meant humiliation before the divine order. Goliath's taunt is crafted with that awareness. Give me a man. If Israel refuses, they admit weakness. If they accept and lose, they confirm Philistine superiority. Either way, Philistia wins, unless something unexpected happens. And here is where the story widens beyond one battlefield. Israel's entire covenant identity is on trial. From Mount Sinai to Shiloh, from the crossing of the Jordan to the fall of Jericho, the narrative had insisted that Israel's strength came from obedience and trust. When they trusted, walls fell. When they rebelled, like at Ai, they were rooted. Now they stand again at a threshold moment. But unlike Jericho, there are no priests circling walls. There is only silence. This silence is heavy because it exposes something universal. Fear does not begin when the enemy speaks. It begins when trust weakens. Saul's fragility is not about height or armor. It is about misplaced foundation. The people had asked for a king to go out before us and fight our battles. That phrase in 1 Samuel 8 is telling. They wanted mediation, representation, someone to stand in the gap. Now the gap is open, and the king does not enter it. That vacuum will soon be filled, but not by the man expected. Before we move forward, consider one more detail. David has already been anointed in Bethlehem, quietly. Privately, the Spirit has rushed upon him, yet he remains a shepherd. He still carries food to his brothers. He is not publicly recognized as future king. Two anointings exist simultaneously, one visible but fading, one hidden but rising. That tension sits beneath the Valley of Elah like a fault line. Saul's fragile kingdom is about to collide with a different kind of leadership, not based on height, not secured by iron, not maintained by political calculation. But the collision has not happened yet. For now the valley holds its breath. The Philistine champion waits, the Israelite king trembles, and history stands on the edge of a single, unexpected step. The Valley of Elah is still there. If you stand there today, southwest of Jerusalem, you can see the ridgelines that frame it. To the north, near Soko. To the south, toward Azekah. The valley floor runs wide enough for movement, yet narrow enough to trap an army in full engagement. A dry brook, seasonal, stony, cuts through the center. It was here that two civilizations faced each other, not skirmishers, not raiders, armies. The Philistines gathered at Soko in Judah and camped between Soko and Azekah at a place called Ephes-Dammim. Israel pitched camp in the Valley of Elah and drew up in battle formation opposite them. That detail matters. Israel was not hiding. They were formed for war, shields up, spears ready, lines aligned. But formation without action can become a shell. Geography created tension. Neither side rushed downhill into the open center. High ground gives advantage. To descend recklessly would invite disaster. So both waited. This is where the champion system comes in. In the ancient Near East, representative combat was not legend. Hittite and Egyptian records hint at duels between elite warriors to settle disputes. It reduced bloodshed. It concentrated honor into a single body. The Hebrew phrase describing Goliath, Ish-ha-Bainim, is precise. The man between the lines. He walks into the empty space that separates two worlds. Imagine the scene. The Philistine line murmuring behind him, bronze glinting. Israel's army watching from the opposite ridge. The valley floor open, exposed, silent except for his steps. And then the voice. The text lingers on Goliath's size, 6 cubits and a span, depending on measurement over 9 feet tall. Some ancient manuscripts, including fragments found among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, give slightly smaller measurements. That textual variation has fueled debate among scholars for generations. But here is the important thing. Whether 9 feet or somewhat less, he was visibly extraordinary, large enough to command silence. His coat of mail weighed 5,000 shekels of bronze. That is well over 100 pounds. Greaves on his legs. A bronze javelin across his back. The shaft of his spear like a weaver's beam, thick, heavy. The iron point alone immense. The emphasis is not subtle, iron, bronze. Wait, Goliath is armored like a moving fortress, and before him walks a shield-bearer. This detail is easy to skip, but it reinforces his status. Champions did not carry everything alone, they had attendants. It heightens his dominance. He is protected even as he advances. Now consider Israel's side. Most soldiers lack swords. Earlier in 1 Samuel, it was noted that the Philistines controlled iron production. Only Saul and Jonathan possessed swords at Michmash. The technological imbalance is real. Goliath represents systemic superiority, but listen to his words carefully. Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? He reframes identity. He does not say servants of Yahweh. He says servants of Saul. It is an insult, yes, but it is also a theological strike. If Israel's strength rests in Saul, they are doomed. He continues, choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. For yourselves, not for God, for yourselves. Goliath reduces the conflict to human scale, man against man, strength against strength. No divine intervention assumed. And then the defiance. I defy the ranks of Israel this day. In Hebrew thought, to defy the ranks was to reproach the living God behind them. The armies of Israel were not simply tribal militias. They were covenant hosts. This is not trash talk. It is a spiritual challenge. Now widen the lens. From Genesis onward, Scripture has shown moments when a single figure stands representatively for many. Adam in Eden, Abraham negotiating for Sodom, Moses interceding after the golden calf, the fate of many tied to one. Here in Allah, that pattern reappears in military form. If one Israelite champion wins, the nation stands. If he falls, the nation collapses. This is not just about physical combat, it is about representation. That concept will echo far beyond this valley, but for now it tightens the tension. 40 days pass, morning and evening. Goliath steps forward like ritual. Each time he speaks, the words chip away at Israel's resolve, and Saul does not answer. Think about that silence. In ancient Israel, the king was more than administrator. He was covenant guardian. Psalm language later describes the king as God's son, enthroned by divine decree. That theology will grow under David and Solomon, but its roots begin here. Yet Saul cannot fulfill that role. The valley becomes a stage not only for war but for exposure. Israel's political solution, monarchy, has not resolved its deeper insecurity. And as the days pass, the psychological weight intensifies. No skirmishes, no arrows exchanged, just waiting, and the giant in the middle. It is here in this suspended moment that the story begins to stretch beyond simple bravery. This is about which story will define Israel, the story of iron and height, or the story of covenant and trust. The ridges hold their breath, and from Bethlehem a young man approaches with bread and cheese, unaware that he is walking into a question larger than himself. David does not arrive as a warrior. He comes from Bethlehem carrying bread for his brothers and cheese for the commander of their 1,000. Jesse, his father, sends him from the quiet hills south of Jerusalem into a valley humming with tension. Bethlehem sits about 10 miles east of Elah, a small town, terraced fields, shepherd paths. It is the kind of place you leave if you want significance, not the kind of place that produces champions. David likely traveled the ridge roads, descending gradually into the Shephelah. As he approaches the Israelite camp, he hears something before he sees it, a voice, the same voice that has echoed for weeks. Goliath steps forward again, issuing his daily challenge. The army reacts the same way it has for 40 days, fear and retreat. Men scatter back from the ridge edge. No one descends. David watches. He is young. The text calls him Naar, a term that can mean youth, servant, or attendant. His older brothers, Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah, stand in Saul's ranks. They have the build for battle. David has a staff and a shepherd's sling, and yet his response is different. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? Notice what David sees. Not height, not armor, identity. Uncircumcised is not mere insult. It marks covenant boundary. Circumcision, given to Abraham in Genesis 17, was the sign of belonging to God's promise. It was physical, yes, but it carried theological weight. David is not fixated on Goliath's size. He is fixated on Goliath's position outside covenant. That shift is subtle but powerful. For 40 days, Israel has viewed Goliath through the lens of fear. David views him through the lens of theology. This is the third major pivot in the story. The giant is not primarily a military problem. He is a defiant outsider challenging the honor of Israel's God. David asks about the reward promised to the man who kills Goliath, freedom from taxes, the king's daughter in marriage, wealth. These are not small incentives, but something deeper drives him. His older brother Eliab rebukes him sharply. "Why have you come down? With whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride." That line stings. Family memory can confine a person. Eliab still sees David as the youngest, the shepherd, the errand boy. David responds calmly. "What have I done now? Was it not but a word?" There is restraint there. He turns from Eliab and continues asking questions. Word spreads. Soon, Saul hears of the shepherd who speaks differently. David is brought before the king. Imagine that scene. Saul in his tent, armor nearby, the weight of expectation pressing on him, and before him stands a youth, likely still smelling faintly of sheep in open fields. "Let no man's heart fail because of him," David says. "Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." Saul looks at him and sees impossibility. "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth." Saul measures according to visible scale. David answers with memory. "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him." This is not reckless bravado. Shepherding in the Judean wilderness was dangerous. Predators were real. A shepherd had to fight for vulnerable animals. David continues, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." He connects private faithfulness to public confrontation. Here the narrative widens again. David does not speak of strategy, he speaks of deliverance. The same word used in Exodus when Israel was delivered from Egypt. The same God who struck Pharaoh's army in the Red Sea. David sees continuity. Saul hesitates, but he consents. "Go, and the Lord be with you." The words sound supportive, but there is uncertainty beneath them. Saul then tries to clothe David in his own armor, bronze helmet, coat of mail, the king's protection. David straps on the sword and attempts to walk. It does not fit. He cannot move freely. I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them. He removes the armor. That moment is not only practical, it is symbolic. The rejected king's armor cannot empower the chosen shepherd. David refuses to fight on Saul's terms. He takes instead his staff, his sling, and 5 smooth stones from the brook. 5 stones. Many have speculated about why 5. Later in 2 Samuel, we learn of other giants from Gath, Lami, Ishbi-Benob, a man with 6 fingers on each hand. Perhaps David anticipated more than one enemy, or perhaps he simply prepared wisely. The text does not force symbolism. It emphasizes readiness. Now imagine him descending into the valley. No bronze. No sword, just leather, sling, and stone. On the opposite side stands Goliath, encased in iron. 2 representatives, 2 visions of strength. One trusts weight and metal, the other trusts memory and covenant. And as David steps forward, the valley shifts from paralysis to movement. The armies lean in. History tightens around a single moment. The man of the middle waits, but now another has entered the space between. And the clash that follows will redefine not only Israel's monarchy, but its understanding of power itself. Goliath sees David coming. At first, perhaps he squints against the sun. The figure approaching is smaller than expected. No heavy armor, no shield bearer in front, just a staff, a sling, a shepherd's bag hanging at his side, and then the giant laughs. The text says he disdained him. He saw that he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. The description almost feels misplaced on a battlefield. Handsome, youthful. Goliath speaks again, but this time the tone shifts from challenge to insult. Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? He curses David by his gods. Notice that phrase, by his gods. The confrontation is now openly theological. Dagon stands behind Goliath in his imagination. The Philistine pantheon stands behind iron and bronze. David answers with words that echo far beyond Elah. You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. The Lord of hosts, Yahweh Sabaoth. The God of heavenly armies. David widens the battlefield in a single sentence. This is not Saul versus Goliath. This is not Israel versus Philistia. This is heaven's authority confronting human arrogance. And then David says something even more daring. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. All the earth. The scale expands beyond 2 ridges. David understands something Saul has forgotten. Israel's story was never meant to stay local. From Genesis onward, Abraham was told that through his seed all nations would be blessed. Israel's victories were meant to reveal God's name beyond its borders. Goliath intended to shame Israel. David intends to reveal God. The Philistine advances. The earth likely trembles under his weight. Armor clanking, spear angled, David runs toward him. He does not wait. He does not posture. He runs. That detail matters. Faith is not passive. He reaches into his bag, takes a stone, slings it, and releases. Now pause here. Sling warfare was not primitive. Archaeological findings and Assyrian reliefs show trained slingers capable of remarkable accuracy. A stone hurled at high velocity could penetrate skull bone. The Benjaminites in Judges are described as left-handed slingers who could hit a hair and not miss. David's weapon was not childish. It was specialized. The stone strikes Goliath in the forehead. The text is blunt. It sinks in. The giant falls forward, face to the ground, face down. The same posture Dagon's statue assumed before the ark in Ashdod decades earlier. It is a quiet echo. Gath once watched its god fall before Israel's God. Now Gath's champion falls in the same way. The symbolism is almost too sharp to ignore. David runs again, this time to the fallen body. He takes Goliath's own sword and severs his head. The Philistine army sees it. Their champion dead, the man who stood in the middle gone, and panic spreads. They flee toward the gates of Ekron and Gath. Israel surges forward, the paralysis breaks, but do not miss the deeper shift. The victory did not come through Saul's armor. It did not come through iron monopoly. It did not come through height. It came through representation. David stood where no one else would. He bore the risk, and his victory became theirs. This concept, one acting on behalf of many, runs like a thread through Scripture. Adam represented humanity in Eden. His failure rippled outward. Moses stood between God and Israel after the golden calf, interceding so they would not be destroyed. Here in Elah, David acts as covenant champion. Centuries later, the Apostle Paul will write about another representative, the last Adam, who stands where humanity failed. The Epistle to the Hebrews will describe Jesus as a high priest who enters on behalf of his people. The pattern is not accidental. Elah is an early shadow, but stay in the valley a moment longer. Dust rising as Philistines retreat, Israel shouting, armor clashing in pursuit, the head of Goliath lifted as proof. Saul watches, his army wins, but he did not lead it. The people sing later, Saul has struck down his thousands and David his 10,000s. The fracture in the monarchy widens, because the shepherd has done what the king would not. The theological pivot is complete. Israel did not need a king like the nations. It needed a heart aligned with covenant. The story of David and Goliath is not about size. It is about misplaced trust. Goliath trusted iron. Saul trusted appearance. David trusted the name. And when the giant fell, something else fell with him. The illusion that power belongs to the tallest figure in the valley. But the story is not over, because giants do not disappear with one stone. And the head of Goliath will soon be carried toward Jerusalem, a city not yet fully Israel's. The implications of that walk will stretch far beyond celebration. Before the valley, before the stone, before the songs, there was Bethlehem, a small town in the hill country of Judah about 5 miles south of Jerusalem. In the days of the judges, it was known mostly for sorrow. The book of Ruth ends there with a fragile hope restored through Boaz and Ruth. Generations later, Jesse lives there, descended from that same line. Bethlehem was not a military center. It had no walls like Hazor, no trade routes like Megiddo. It was a shepherding town, terraced hills, olive trees, quiet nights broken only by wind and distant animal sounds. This is where the next king of Israel was hiding in plain sight. When Samuel arrives in Bethlehem, he comes with tension. The elders tremble when they see him. A prophet does not visit casually. Samuel had confronted Saul. He had declared the kingdom torn away. His presence means something is shifting. He calls Jesse and his sons to sacrifice. One by one, the sons pass before him. Eliab first, tall, strong, impressive. Samuel thinks, surely the Lord's anointed is before him. The thought is immediate, human instinct, the same instinct that had shaped Israel's choice of Saul, and then comes the correction. Do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, for the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. That sentence changes everything. It reframes kingship itself. Israel had asked for a king like the nations. Visible, commanding, reassuring. Saul fit that pattern, but God chooses differently. Abinadab passes, Shammah passes, 7 sons in total. None chosen. Samuel asks, are all your sons here? Jesse hesitates. There remains yet the youngest, but behold, he is keeping the sheep. The youngest. In the ancient world, birth order mattered. Inheritance flowed through the firstborn. Authority rested with elders. The youngest was often an afterthought. David is not even invited to the initial sacrifice. Pause and feel that. The future king of Israel is overlooked in his own household. Samuel insists he be brought. When David arrives, the description is brief, ruddy, with beautiful eyes, and handsome. The text does not exaggerate his strength. It does not dwell on physical dominance. Instead, the Lord speaks, arise, anoint him, for this is he. Oil pours down his head in a quiet Bethlehem courtyard. No army, no throne, no crown. Just oil and a promise. From that day forward, the Spirit of the Lord rushes upon David. At the same time, the Spirit departs from Saul. 2 trajectories cross invisibly. This is the beginning of a different kind of leadership. Now widen the frame. David's identity as shepherd matters deeply. Shepherd imagery runs through Israel's story. Abraham was a shepherd. Jacob tended flocks. Moses met God at Horeb while tending sheep. Shepherding was humble work, but it trained watchfulness, patience, courage in isolation. In Genesis, Jacob wrestles through the night. In Exodus, Moses leads a stubborn people through wilderness. Shepherding prepares men to guide more than animals. David learns to defend what is vulnerable. He learns to endure silence. He learns to act without applause. These are not small lessons. Later, when prophets speak of failed leaders, they use shepherd language. Ezekiel condemns shepherds who feed themselves instead of the flock. Jeremiah rebukes kings who scatter sheep. Leadership in Israel is measured in care, not domination. David's formation in Bethlehem stands in contrast to Goliath's formation in Gath. Goliath was shaped by walls and weapons. David was shaped by fields and solitude. Goliath's strength was visible early. David's was hidden. There is something deeply unsettling about that contrast because it forces a question. Where does true authority begin? In public display or in unseen faithfulness? Jewish tradition later reflects on David's youth with reverence. The Psalms attributed to him often carry the memory of shepherd life. "The Lord is my shepherd," he writes in Psalm 23. That metaphor does not come from theory, it comes from lived experience. And that psalm, so often read at gravesides and whispered in hospital rooms, has its roots in Bethlehem's hills. The overlooked son becomes the poet king, but at this moment he is simply anointed and sent back to the sheep. That detail is crucial. Anointing does not mean immediate promotion. David returns to obscurity. Imagine the walk back to the fields after Samuel leaves, oil still faintly scented in his hair, no explanation given to neighbors, no announcement made to Israel, chosen but hidden. This is the rhythm of many biblical callings. Joseph dreamed before he ruled. Moses fled before he led. Elijah hid before he confronted Ahab. Preparation often happens in quiet places. Bethlehem is one of those places. And from its fields, a shepherd will one day stand in a valley and speak words about the Lord of hosts that shift a nation's story. But before that public moment, David must learn what it means to trust when no one is watching, because the giant in Elah will not be the only one he faces, and the strength needed for kingship will not come from height. It will come from a heart shaped in hidden ground. David's anointing in Bethlehem did not change his daily routine. He still rose before sunrise, still led sheep across rocky slopes, still listened for the distant sound of predators in the brush. The hills south of Jerusalem are not gentle, they are rugged, limestone ridges, sparse vegetation, caves cut into the rock. A shepherd in that terrain learns alertness, he learns the landscape. He knows which valley holds water after rain, which slope hides danger. He learns to count constantly. One missing lamb matters. In Psalm 78, written generations later, Israel remembers this detail carefully. God chose David his servant and took him from the sheepfolds. From following the nursing ewes, he brought him to shepherd Jacob his people. From following ewes, not commanding armies. The text emphasizes tenderness before authority. Now consider something else. While David tends sheep, Saul's court in Gibeah is unraveling. The troubling spirit afflicts him. His servants suggest music to calm him. They recommend a skillful player of the lyre, someone who is brave, prudent in speech, and handsome. They describe David without knowing he has already been anointed. Saul sends for him. David leaves Bethlehem again, this time not to fight but to serve. He stands in the royal court, harp in hand, playing music to soothe a tormented king. Think about that tension. The future king easing the distress of the rejected one. It is not triumph, it is humility. David does not announce his anointing. He does not hint at destiny, he plays. This is formation of another kind. He watches Saul's insecurity up close. He sees how fear distorts leadership. He sees how jealousy begins to flicker even before Goliath falls. The palace teaches him what the pasture could not. Leadership is not only about courage in open fields. It is about restraint in closed rooms. Now step back into Bethlehem for a moment. David's lineage matters. The book of Ruth closes with a genealogy. Boaz fathered Obed, Obed fathered Jesse, Jesse fathered David. Ruth was a Moabite. That means David's great-grandmother was a foreigner, a woman who once stood outside Israel's covenant boundaries. Yet she entered through loyalty and faith. David's bloodline carries outsider mercy inside it. That detail will matter later when he shows kindness to foreigners and when prophets speak of nations joining Israel's hope. Bethlehem itself carries memory. It is near the burial place of Rachel. Genesis records Jacob setting up a pillar when Rachel died near Ephrath, another name for Bethlehem. Rachel's tears echo in that soil. Centuries later, the prophet Micah will speak of Bethlehem again. But you, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel. Too little. Bethlehem's identity is smallness, insignificance in political terms. Yet repeatedly, God chooses it as origin point. There is a pattern forming. The overlooked son from the overlooked town becomes the instrument of national turning. Now return to the Valley of Elah. When David arrives with bread for his brothers, he does not come as an anointed prince. He comes as a delivery boy. The irony is sharp. He leaves sheep in the care of a keeper. That small detail shows responsibility. He does not abandon his post recklessly. He arranges continuity before leaving. When he hears Goliath's challenge, his reaction is immediate outrage, not personal offense, but covenant concern. That reaction was shaped in Bethlehem. In solitude, David likely recited the stories of Torah. Shepherds had long hours, memory-filled silence. Genesis, Exodus, the promises to Abraham, the deliverance at the Red Sea, the conquest under Joshua. Those stories formed his imagination. So when Goliath speaks, David does not see a giant. He sees a man standing outside promise, defying the name bound to Israel's existence. That theological reflex does not come from the palace. It comes from pasture. Now here is a deeper layer. In 2 Samuel, long after Elah, David will face other giants from Gath, descendants of the same clan as Goliath. Names like Ishbi-Benob and Lami appear. The text even mentions a man with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. The giant problem does not end in one battle. And neither does David's formation. Bethlehem prepared him for Elah. Elah will prepare him for Hebron. Hebron will prepare him for Jerusalem. Leadership unfolds in stages. The overlooked son is being shaped for a throne he does not yet see. But before crowns come caves, before temples come wilderness, before glory comes confrontation. And as David stands in the valley, sling in hand, he carries more than stones. He carries Bethlehem, its smallness, its memory, its hidden oil. The shepherd is about to confront the champion. But the roots of that confrontation stretch back through quiet hills, foreign grandmothers, and a prophet's trembling hands. Nothing about this moment is accidental, and nothing about David's courage is spontaneous. It was grown in obscurity. When David stood over the fallen body of Goliath, sword in hand, the valley erupted. But inside Saul's tent, something more complicated began. Victory should have brought relief. It did for a moment. The Philistines fled toward Sharaim, toward Gath and Ekron. Israel pursued. The immediate threat dissolved in dust and shouting. Yet Saul's question lingers in the text like a crack in stone. Whose son is this youth? That is not a casual inquiry. Saul had already met David. He had already listened to him play the lyre. He had already summoned him from Bethlehem to soothe his troubled spirit. So why the question? Some scholars suggest political calculation. In the ancient world, lineage determined alliance. If David is to marry into the royal family, as promised to the champion, Saul needs clarity. Others see something more psychological. Saul recognizes the shift. The shepherd has done what the king would not, and something inside him tightens. When David returns with Goliath's head still in his hand, he does not look like a court musician anymore. He looks like a symbol. Saul looks at him and sees both salvation and threat. This tension will grow. It will darken into jealousy. It will drive Saul to hurl spears in his own palace. But here, in this early moment, it is still forming, and David does not yet see it. He speaks simply, "I am the son of your servant Jesse the Bethlehemite." That phrase matters, son of your servant. He places himself beneath Saul, not above him. There is no arrogance in his voice, no claim of destiny. The overlooked son remains grounded. Now widen the scale again. The victory at Elah does more than humiliate Gath. It destabilizes Philistine confidence across the Pentapolis, Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. Word travels fast along coastal trade routes. The champion has fallen. The narrative of invincibility cracks. In the ancient world, morale could shape geopolitics as much as weapons. But the internal shift in Israel may prove more consequential. The people begin to sing. Saul has struck down his thousands and David his 10,000s. Songs shape memory. They crystallize events into identity. Miriam sang after the Red Sea. Deborah sang after Sisera fell. Now women in Israel sing about David. Public perception shifts quickly. Saul hears the song and he burns. They have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed thousands. What more can he have but the kingdom? There it is, the fear of loss. The fragile foundation of Saul's kingship is now exposed by comparison. Remember the pivot earlier in Bethlehem. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. Saul was chosen partly because he looked like a king. Now he is being eclipsed by someone who does not. The illusion of visible strength fractures completely. This is not merely political rivalry, it is theological reversal. The monarchy Israel demanded, modeled after other nations, is being reshaped from within. And here is something even deeper. David does not seize power after Elah. He returns to Saul's service. He fights more battles on Israel's behalf. He acts with loyalty. When Saul's jealousy turns violent, David refuses to retaliate. Twice he spares Saul's life in a cave at En-Gedi and later in the wilderness of Ziph. He could have taken the throne by force. He does not. That restraint traces back to Bethlehem. He understands anointing does not equal self-promotion. He trusts timing. This is the deeper contrast with Goliath. Goliath trusted immediate dominance, visible intimidation. David trusts unseen promise. Now step back and consider the broader theological thread. In Genesis, Joseph is overlooked by his brothers, sold into slavery, imprisoned unjustly. Yet he rises not by grasping but by faithfulness. In Exodus, Moses flees Egypt and spends 40 years in Midian before leading Israel. In the Gospels centuries later, Jesus grows up in Nazareth, a town once dismissed with the words, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" The pattern repeats. God's chosen instruments often emerge from margins. Bethlehem is one of those margins. The prophet Micah's words linger in the background. "From you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel." David fulfills that first layer, but his story will not end with him. The Valley of Elah was not the final stage. It was a doorway. Through it, Israel begins to see a different kind of king, one shaped by solitude. One who fights not to protect ego but to defend covenant honor. Yet David is not perfect. He will stumble. He will sin gravely. Bathsheba and Uriah will mark his reign with blood and sorrow. The sword will not depart from his house, as Nathan later declares. But here, at this early moment, he stands as contrast. The overlooked son who stepped into the middle, the shepherd who carried memory into battle, the anointed one who refused to wear another man's armor. The story of Goliath is often told as the triumph of the small over the large, but it is more than that. It is the exposure of hollow strength. It is the beginning of a monarchy reshaped by heart rather than height, and it sets in motion a line that will run from Bethlehem to Hebron, from Hebron to Jerusalem, and far beyond Israel's borders. The valley is quiet now. The stone lies somewhere in dust, but the consequences are just beginning, because giants fall loudly, but jealousy grows quietly. And the overlooked son is stepping into a future far heavier than a sling. It is easy to romanticize the sling. Children's books shrink it into something harmless, a strip of leather, a smooth stone, a lucky shot. But in the ancient world, a sling was not a toy. It was a weapon of range, precision, and force. Assyrian reliefs carved during the reign of Sennacherib show slingers standing behind shield-bearers, launching stones with terrifying velocity. Archaeologists have uncovered sling stones across the Levant, carefully shaped, aerodynamic, some inscribed with markings. In trained hands, a sling could hurl a projectile at speeds capable of fracturing skulls and penetrating helmets. David did not improvise a childish tactic. He chose a weapon suited to his skill. Now return to the valley. Goliath's armor was designed for close combat. Heavy bronze scales overlapping like fish skin, greaves protecting his legs. A javelin ready for mid-range thrust. A massive spear built for crushing impact. He expected a sword fight. David refused to give him one. When Saul tried to place royal armor on him, David removed it. "I have not tested these," he said. That line reveals something deeper than comfort. Tested. David would not trust what he had not learned to wield. He knew the rhythm of a sling, the weight of a stone, the timing of release. Years in the wilderness had shaped muscle memory. Goliath relied on visible dominance. David relied on trained trust. This confrontation was not irrational faith versus rational technology. It was competing technologies, one heavy, centralized, intimidating, the other light, mobile, precise. The theological layer runs alongside the tactical one. "You come to me with sword and spear and javelin," David said, "but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts." That phrase is not mystical incantation. It is covenant alignment. In Israel's history, the name carried presence. When Moses asked at the burning bush who he should say sent him, the answer was, "I am." The name revealed character, faithfulness, self-existence. David is not invoking magic. He is aligning himself with history. Think back to Hannah's song in 1 Samuel 2. Before Saul ever ruled, before David was born, Hannah prayed words that echo through Elah. "The bows of the mighty are broken, but the feeble bind on strength." The Lord kills and brings to life. He brings down to Sheol and raises up. Hannah's song frames the entire monarchy narrative. Power reversals, proud humbled, lowly lifted. Her son Samuel anointed both Saul and David. The theology was already written before the stone ever flew. Now widen the scale again. Iron was the future of warfare. The Philistines understood that. They controlled smithing centers. They monopolized production. In economic terms, they were ahead of Israel. But technology does not automatically equal destiny. Egypt had chariots at the Red Sea. Israel had parted water. Jericho had walls. Israel had trumpets and obedience. Time and again, the biblical narrative confronts visible superiority with unexpected intervention. This is not anti-technology. It is anti-idolatry of technology. There is a difference. Goliath's mistake was not wearing armor. It was trusting it absolutely. When he saw David, he interpreted weakness. He did not consider range. He did not consider speed. He did not consider that the battlefield might not play out on his terms. Pride narrows imagination. David ran toward him. That run is critical. It disrupts expectation. Goliath likely expected hesitation, a gradual approach, perhaps negotiation. Instead, he faces momentum. The sling whirls, one stone released at the right moment. The impact is immediate. Goliath falls forward. Now pause again. The stone strikes the forehead. In ancient warfare, the forehead was often exposed between helmet and brow. Even heavy armor has limits. A precise strike in that gap can end a battle in seconds. David did not need brute force. He needed accuracy. This moment challenges a common assumption. We often tell this story as though faith replaces skill. It does not. Faith directs skill. David had practiced long before Elah. He had faced lions and bears. He had missed stones and tried again. He had learned distance by instinct. God did not bypass his training. He used it. This is the deeper lesson. Trust does not cancel preparation. It redeems it. And when Goliath collapses, it is not chaos that follows. It is clarity. The Philistine line wavers. Their champion, representative, invincible symbol lies motionless. The illusion cracks, and Israel surges forward. But do not miss what just happened. A shepherd redefined strength. A sling outmatched a spear, and a name proved stronger than iron. Yet the story does not end with tactical victory, because technology can shift, weapons can evolve, but the temptation to trust invisible power returns in every generation. The sling and the spear are more than tools, they are metaphors, and Israel will soon face a choice, whether to remain aligned with the theology of Elah or drift back toward the comfort of visible dominance. The valley has delivered its lesson. The question is whether anyone will remember it. When Goliath fell, the battle did not end with silence. It exploded. The Philistines, who moments earlier stood confident behind their champion, saw him collapse face first into the dust. Their symbol of dominance gone in an instant. Shock rippled through their ranks, and shock in battle spreads faster than strategy. Israel shouted. The same men who had retreated for 40 days now surged forward. They pursued the Philistines down the valley, through Shaaraim, toward Gath and Ekron. The text records the chase with specific place names, grounding the chaos in geography. This was not mythic fog. This was pursuit across real terrain. Blood on stones, shields abandoned in flight. The reversal was complete. But the deeper reversal had already happened before the first Israelite sword struck a fleeing soldier. The psychological stronghold broke. For 40 days, Israel had believed a lie, that visible superiority equals inevitable victory. In one moment, that lie collapsed. Now think about what that does to a nation. Stories shape identity. At Sinai, Israel's story was liberation. At Jericho, it was obedience. At Ai, it was warning. Now at Elah, it becomes something else, courage anchored in covenant. David's victory did more than remove a threat. It restored memory. It reminded Israel who they were supposed to be, the covenant people, not dependent on chariots like Egypt, not dependent on iron like Philistia, dependent on the Lord of hosts. That phrase begins to take on weight here. Later, prophets like Isaiah will use it frequently. The Lord of hosts who commands nations, who raises up Assyria and brings down Babylon. But the roots of that title's emotional force stretch back to moments like Elah. The God of armies does not need visible dominance. He needs trust. Now widen the lens further. The concept of representative victory is central here. David did not fight only for himself. His triumph became Israel's triumph. This pattern deepens in later biblical theology. In Psalm 20, Israel prays, "Some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God." That line is not abstract poetry. It echoes lived history, battles where Israel faced superior equipment and survived. In Psalm 144, traditionally attributed to David, the king speaks of God as the one who trains his hands for war and his fingers for battle. Notice the balance. God trains hands, skill matters, but it is God who grants victory. Centuries later, when Paul writes to the Corinthians, he speaks of weapons not of the world but divinely powerful for tearing down strongholds. He borrows the imagery of warfare to describe spiritual confrontation. The story of Elah becomes template, not for reckless bravery, but for confronting powers that appear unshakable. And here is the deeper tension. Israel learned this lesson repeatedly, and repeatedly forgot it. Under Solomon, wealth and military expansion increased, chariots multiplied, alliances formed with Egypt and Tyre. The temple rose in Jerusalem, a glorious structure. Yet even there, the temptation returned to equate visible grandeur with divine favor. Later, when the kingdom divided, Rehoboam in Jerusalem, Jeroboam in Samaria, the northern kingdom relied heavily on political maneuvering and foreign alliances. Trust shifted again toward visible power. The prophets warned them. Hosea condemned reliance on Assyria. Isaiah rebuked alliances with Egypt. The same tension, sling versus spear, echoed across centuries. Now return to David for a moment. After Elah, he could have interpreted the victory as personal greatness. He did not, at least not immediately. His early psalms reflect dependence, not self-exaltation. "The Lord is my rock," he writes, "not my skill, not my courage." The danger, though, is subtle. Success can breed the same illusion as armor. It can become a new spear. Israel's future will test whether they internalize the lesson of Allah or simply celebrate the spectacle. Because the story of Goliath can easily shrink into legend, a small boy defeating a giant. But that reduction misses the scale. This was civilizational pressure meeting covenant memory. It was iron monopoly meeting shepherd training. It was fear meeting trust. And in that collision, trust prevailed. But only because someone stepped into the middle. The question remains, who will step into the middle next? Because giants do not vanish from history. They change form. Empires rise. Technologies advance. Systems grow complex. The temptation to rely on visible dominance returns in every age. Allah stands as warning and invitation. Warning against idolatry of strength. Invitation to trust beyond what can be measured. The sling and the spear will always coexist. The choice between them will never disappear. And Israel, standing on the edge of a new era under David, must decide what kind of nation it will become. The stone has fallen, but the test has only begun. David did not leave Goliath's body in the valley. He cut off the giant's head with Goliath's own sword. That detail is deliberate. The weapon meant to intimidate Israel becomes the instrument of finality. The spear that symbolized dominance lies useless. The sword forged in Philistine iron finishes the story against its owner. There is irony there, but there is also something political. David takes the head and later brings it to Jerusalem. Jerusalem. At this point in the narrative, Jerusalem is not yet Israel's capital. It is still largely a Jebusite stronghold. Saul rules from Gibeah. The city that will one day house the temple and the throne of David remains outside full Israelite control. Why carry the head there? The text does not explain directly, but the symbolism is sharp. It is a declaration of intent. The giant from Gath is defeated, and the future center of Israel's kingdom is already in view. The story begins to stretch forward. David's victory at Elah does not simply humiliate Philistia. It announces a shift in Israel's trajectory. The shepherd who refused Saul's armor will one day capture Jerusalem and make it the political and spiritual heart of the nation. The head of Goliath foreshadows that future. Now step back to the immediate aftermath. Saul takes David into his service permanently. Jonathan, Saul's son, forms a covenant with David. The text says Jonathan's soul was knit to David's soul. He strips himself of his robe and gives it to David along with armor, sword, bow, and belt. That gesture is astonishing. Jonathan is the crown prince. By right of succession, the throne should pass to him, yet he recognizes something in David. Perhaps he sees the Spirit's favor. Perhaps he sees courage aligned with faith. Whatever the reason, he yields symbolically. He gives David royal garments. Earlier, David rejected Saul's armor because it did not fit. Now Jonathan freely gives his own. The contrast is striking. One king tries to impose protection. One prince offers partnership. This is where the story moves from battlefield to heart. Jealousy begins to grow in Saul, but covenant loyalty grows in Jonathan. The victory over Goliath creates division and devotion at the same time. And here the theological tension deepens. The people sing. Saul hears. Comparison poisons him. The man who once stood tall among Israel now feels small beside a shepherd. Fear transforms. It is no longer fear of Philistine iron. It is fear of losing status. And that fear will drive Saul into paranoia. He hurls a spear at David in his own house. The weapon returns, not in a valley, but in a palace. This is the subtle tragedy of Saul. He witnessed the lesson of Allah firsthand. He saw trust defeat intimidation. He heard David speak in the name of the Lord of hosts, and yet instead of absorbing the lesson, he shifts his fear. From giant to successor. This is the danger of shallow victory. If the heart does not change, fear simply finds a new target. Now widen the lens once more. The story of Goliath will echo through Israel's memory. It will shape royal theology. It will reinforce the idea that God exalts the humble and humbles the proud. But it will also foreshadow something larger. The concept of a representative champion, one who fights on behalf of many, does not end with David. In later Jewish expectation, the Anointed One, the Messiah, would embody that role on a grander scale. A son of David who would confront not just Philistine threats but deeper enemies. The New Testament writers draw that line carefully. Paul speaks of Jesus as the son of David according to the flesh. The Gospels open with genealogies that trace back through Jesse, through Ruth, through Abraham. Bethlehem reappears, not randomly, intentionally. The overlooked town becomes birthplace again, and the idea of one standing in the middle between humanity and its greatest enemy returns with greater weight. Elah was local, Golgotha would be global, but that lies ahead. For now, the sling rests. The spear lies unused. The head of Goliath serves as a warning to every nation that equates size with security, and Israel stands at a crossroads. They have seen what trust can do. They have witnessed a shepherd step into the space no king would enter. The question now is whether they will build their future on that memory, because technology will advance. Empires will rise. Babylon will come. Rome will come. And in every age, giants will stand in valleys, daring people to measure strength only by what can be seen. The story of Goliath is not preserved because of spectacle. It is preserved because it reveals a principle that refuses to age. Power without covenant collapses. Trust anchored in the living God endures. David walks away from Elah not yet crowned, not yet enthroned, but already marked. The shepherd has entered history, and Israel will never be the same. When David carried the head of Goliath away from the Valley of Elah, he was not just holding a trophy. He was carrying a political earthquake. In the ancient world, decapitation was not random brutality. It was a message. Kings displayed heads on city walls. Assyrian reliefs show piles of skulls outside conquered towns. It signaled dominance, finality, humiliation. David, the shepherd from Bethlehem, now holds the severed symbol of Philistine pride, and everyone sees it. The pursuit through Shaaraim toward Gath and Ekron left Philistine bodies scattered along the road, but the greater damage was psychological. Gath had sent its strongest. The remnant of the Anakim, the man whose height embodied ancient fear, and he fell. For Philistia, this was not a minor loss. Gath was one of the 5 pillars of their confederation. Along with Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Ekron, it formed a pentapolis that controlled trade routes along the coastal plain. Their chariots and iron production gave them leverage over inland tribes. Now word spreads through those cities. The champion is dead. Imagine the gates of Gath when survivors arrive. Dust-covered soldiers. Panic in their eyes, armor dented, breathless reports. The elders of the city gather, priests of Dagon stand uncertain. The last time Gath dealt with Israel's God, it involved plagues and panic when the ark was brought there in the days of Eli. Now another humiliation comes, not through disease but through a shepherd's sling. The theological blow lands twice, but here is the critical shift. Philistia does not disappear after Elah. They retreat. They regroup. They will fight again. This is not total annihilation. It is destabilization, and destabilization changes regional politics. Israel under Saul suddenly has breathing room, momentum, confidence. Villages once vulnerable to Philistine raids now stand stronger, but that breathing room introduces a new tension. David's name spreads. He goes out and fights successfully wherever Saul sends him. The text in 1 Samuel 18 emphasizes this repeatedly. David had success in all his undertakings, for the Lord was with him. Phrase, "the Lord was with him," is devastating to Saul because it implies something has shifted. Earlier in the narrative, the Spirit rushed upon Saul. Now it rushes upon David. Power has not just shifted militarily, it has shifted spiritually, and the people see it. When David returns from battle, women from the cities of Israel come out singing and dancing with tambourines and instruments. The song is simple but explosive. Saul has struck down his thousands and David his 10,000s. Numbers become narrative. Comparison becomes poison. Saul's anger flares. The text says he eyed David from that day on. Envy changes perception. Every success David achieves now feels like a threat. This is the deeper political shockwave. The fall of Goliath exposed Saul's fragility publicly. Before Elah, Saul's failures were largely internal: disobedience at Gilgal, compromise with Amalek, Samuel's rebuke in private. After Elah, comparison makes the fracture visible. Leadership that cannot celebrate the courage of another is already collapsing. Now widen the lens beyond Israel. Neighboring nations would have watched these developments carefully. Moab, Ammon, Edom, Aram all monitored Israel's stability. A strong Philistine presence in the west kept Israel contained. A weakened Philistia opens possibility. Regional balance shifts. And at the center of that shift stands a young man who still calls himself the son of your servant Jesse. David does not yet claim political ambition, but history is moving around him. The head of Goliath brought toward Jerusalem signals something else quietly. Jerusalem is not yet the capital. It is still controlled by Jebusites. Yet David's later conquest of that city will become foundational to Israel's identity. The city of David, Zion, the place where the ark will rest. By carrying Goliath's head there, even before capturing it, David symbolically connects victory over Philistine pride with future national center. It is as if the narrative whispers, the valley was only the beginning. But political shockwaves rarely move cleanly. They fracture relationships. Saul's jealousy does not erupt immediately into open war. It simmers. A troubling spirit comes upon him again. David plays the lyre, and Saul, gripping a spear, attempts to pin him to the wall. The spear returns, once a weapon of Philistine intimidation, now a weapon of Israelite paranoia. Saul tries twice, David escapes twice. The palace becomes more dangerous than the valley, and here the story turns darker, because external giants are easier to confront than internal ones. Goliath stood in open defiance. Saul's insecurity hides behind authority. The political shockwave is not only regional, it is personal, and the kingdom begins to tremble from within. The shepherd who toppled a giant must now navigate a king unraveling in fear. The head of Goliath may have silenced Philistine taunts, but it awakened something far more volatile inside Israel's throne room. And that instability will soon drive David not into open battle, but into wilderness exile. The valley victory gave Israel confidence, but it also set the stage for a conflict that iron cannot solve, because the next giant David faces will not wear bronze, he will wear a crown. Saul's jealousy does not remain a private struggle, it becomes policy. At first, it hides behind strategy. Saul sends David into battle repeatedly, hoping perhaps that the Philistines will do what he cannot openly attempt. The text says Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him but had departed from Saul. Fear shifts again, not fear of Goliath, fear of replacement. Saul offers David his daughter Merab in marriage, then withdraws her at the last moment. Later he offers Michal another daughter with a condition: 100 Philistine foreskins as bride price. It is a cruel calculation. Saul hopes David will fall in the attempt, but David succeeds. He brings back double the demand. The plan backfires. The people's admiration grows. Saul's anxiety deepens. Political instability begins to ripple outward. Court officials watch carefully. Jonathan remains loyal to David. Michal loves him. Abner, Saul's military commander, navigates tension cautiously. The monarchy is splitting internally. Now widen the scope. Philistia does not disappear from the narrative. They continue to threaten Israel's borders. Battles flare intermittently, but something has changed. The fear that once paralyzed Israel in the Valley of Elah no longer dominates. Instead, the central crisis becomes internal. This is one of the great ironies of history. External threats can unify a people. Internal insecurity can destroy them. Saul begins to see conspiracy everywhere. David's popularity becomes evidence of rebellion. Trust erodes. In 1 Samuel 21 and 22, David flees to Nob, where the priests serve at the tabernacle. He receives bread, the bread of the presence, from Ahimelech. When Saul hears of this, he accuses the priests of treason. And then comes one of the darkest moments in Saul's reign. He orders the slaughter of the priests of Nob. 85 men wearing linen ephods are killed. The city is struck down, men, women, children. This is not the behavior of a stable king. The man who once rallied Israel against Nahash now turns his sword against his own spiritual leaders. The theological center fractures. The ark once moved from Shiloh to Ashdod to Gath. Now the priesthood itself is threatened by Israel's own king. One priest escapes, Abiathar, and flees to David. The transfer of priestly loyalty begins quietly here. The political shockwave expands into religious territory. Saul's insecurity has crossed a line, and David becomes not only military hero but refuge for the displaced. Now consider the wilderness. David gathers around him those in distress, in debt, bitter in soul. They assemble at the cave of Adullam. From Bethlehem's hills to Elah's valley to Adullam's caves, the trajectory shifts from triumph to exile. It is a pattern seen before. Moses fled to Midian after confronting Pharaoh. Elijah fled to Horeb after defeating the prophets of Baal. Victory does not guarantee stability. Often it invites opposition. David, now hunted by Saul, experiences something profound. He becomes the anointed one without a throne, chosen, but not yet enthroned. This tension deepens his theology. Many of the psalms attributed to David emerge from this wilderness period. Psalms that cry out from caves, psalms that speak of enemies closing in, psalms that wrestle with betrayal and trust. Why do the nations rage? Psalm 2 asks, a royal psalm that likely grew out of David's later reign, but its emotional roots trace back to these formative years. The head of Goliath did not end conflict, it exposed deeper fractures. And here comes another shift in scale. The concept of the anointed one, Mashiach in Hebrew, begins to take on greater meaning. David is anointed by Samuel. Saul is anointed earlier. The priest is anointed. Anointing marks divine selection, but the anointed can suffer. This becomes critical later when prophets speak of a future anointed king who will endure rejection before glory. Isaiah will describe a servant who is despised and rejected, yet ultimately vindicated. The memory of David's wilderness years will inform that vision. The giant in the valley was visible. The giant in the palace is invisible. Jealousy, insecurity, fear of losing power. These forces destabilize kingdoms more effectively than foreign armies. The political shockwave from Goliath's fall spreads in unexpected directions. Philistia weakens temporarily, Israel fractures internally, and David learns that defeating one giant does not exempt him from facing another. But unlike Goliath, Saul is still the Lord's anointed. David refuses to raise his hand against him. Twice, he spares Saul's life. In the cave at En-Gedi, he cuts off the corner of Saul's robe but will not strike him. His conscience troubles him even for that. The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed. That restraint marks him. The shepherd who ran toward a giant now refuses to run toward a throne. He waits. History slows, and the kingdom hangs in tension. The fall of Goliath changed the political landscape, but it also began a painful reshaping of Israel's understanding of leadership. Because strength is not proven only in open battle, it is proven in restraint. And the story is widening from valley to palace to wilderness, toward a future where Jerusalem will finally become more than a distant silhouette on the horizon. But that future must pass through exile first, and the lessons of Elah must survive the pressure of envy. Otherwise, the spear will win after all. The wilderness changes a man. David leaves the noise of court and the applause of victory behind. He moves through places like Adullam, Keilah, Ziph, Maon, and En-Gedi. These are not grand cities. They are caves, deserts, rocky strongholds along the Dead Sea's western edge. In those caves, the future king sleeps on stone. Men gather around him, 400 at first, then more. Not nobles, not polished officials, the distressed, the indebted, the discontented. This becomes David's first kingdom. Rough, loyal, dangerous. Here, leadership is not ceremonial, it is survival. Meanwhile, Saul continues to hunt him. Imagine the absurdity. The king of Israel, with trained troops and royal authority, chasing the man who saved his army from humiliation. Fear has fully inverted reason. At Keilah, David inquires of the Lord before rescuing the city from Philistine attack. Even in exile, he defends Israel. But when he learns that the people of Keilah might hand him over to Saul, he withdraws. He learns caution. He learns not to equate gratitude with loyalty. In the wilderness of Ziph, the Ziphites inform Saul of David's location. Betrayal comes not from Philistines but from fellow Israelites. The internal fracture deepens. Now consider the cave at En-Gedi. Saul enters alone, unaware that David and his men are hiding deeper inside. The opportunity is perfect. One strike, one moment, the throne secured. David's men whisper urgently, "Here is the day of which the Lord said to you," but David does not kill him. He cuts off the corner of Saul's robe instead. Even that troubles him. His heart strikes him for harming the garment of the Lord's anointed. This restraint is not weakness. It is theological discipline. David refuses to seize what God has not yet delivered. Remember Elah. There David ran toward the giant because covenant honor demanded it. Here he steps back because covenant order demands it. The same heart, different action. This is leadership shaped by more than impulse. Saul exits the cave unaware. David calls after him, revealing what he could have done. He holds up the torn robe corner. Saul weeps. For a moment, clarity returns. He acknowledges David's righteousness. He even confesses, "You shall be king over Israel." But the confession does not cure insecurity. Soon, pursuit resumes. This cycle reveals something sobering. External giants are easier to kill than internal ones. Goliath fell in seconds. Saul's jealousy drags on for years. Now widen the scale once more. The story of David's restraint becomes part of Israel's royal theology. The idea that the king is accountable to God, not self-made, shapes future expectations. Later, when Solomon dedicates the temple in Jerusalem, he prays that if Israel sins and turns back, God would hear from heaven. The monarchy is placed under covenant law, but the seeds of that humility were planted in caves. In refusing to grasp the throne prematurely, David models something radical in the ancient world. Kings usually take power. They eliminate rivals. They consolidate quickly. David waits, and waiting becomes part of his legitimacy. Centuries later, this pattern will echo again. When Jesus stands before Pilate, accused and silent, he does not seize power. When tempted in the wilderness with kingdoms of the world, he refuses shortcuts. The pattern of the anointed who waits, who suffers before reigning, runs from David forward. The Valley of Elah gave Israel a spectacle. The wilderness gave Israel a king shaped by restraint. And eventually, Saul's reign ends not at David's hand, but on Mount Gilboa. Fighting the Philistines again, Saul falls on his own sword after his sons, including Jonathan, are killed. The Philistines display Saul's body on the wall of Beit-Shan. The irony is painful. The king who feared giants dies by the same enemy he once rallied Israel against. But David does not rejoice. He laments, "How the mighty have fallen." He mourns Saul and Jonathan sincerely. He honors the fallen king despite years of persecution. This response seals his moral authority. The political shockwave from Goliath's fall has now reshaped the monarchy entirely. Saul's visible strength has collapsed. David's hidden formation has endured. The throne will pass, not by assassination, but by providence. And when David is finally crowned in Hebron and later in Jerusalem after capturing it from the Jebusites, Israel enters a new phase. The shepherd becomes king. The caves give way to a city. The city becomes Zion. And the memory of a sling against a spear remains embedded in Israel's story. But giants are not gone. The text will later mention other descendants of the giants from Gath, Lami, Ishbi-Benob, a man with 6 fingers on each hand. The threat resurfaces. History does not eliminate patterns easily. Yet the lesson of Elah continues to whisper across generations. Do not trust the spear. Do not fear the height. Remember the name. Because every kingdom, every empire, every age will face its own valley. And the question will return, who stands in the middle? If the story ended in the Valley of Elah, it would feel complete. Goliath falls. Israel surges forward, the shepherd rises, but Scripture does something unexpected. It tells us there were more giants. Years after Elah, after Saul's death, after David's years in Hebron, after Jerusalem becomes the city of David, the text in 2 Samuel 21 records another series of battles with Philistines. And in those battles, new names appear: Ishbi-benob, Saph, Lami, and a man with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, all described as descendants of the giants in Gath. The city returns. The lineage returns. The problem was never just one man. This is important because it reframes Elah. Goliath was not the last of his kind. He was one of several. The Hebrew term used in these passages connects them to the Rephaim, a word that appears earlier in Deuteronomy and Joshua when describing ancient giant clans in places like Bashan and the Valley of Rephaim near Jerusalem. The memory stretches back to Og, king of Bashan, whose bed was said to be enormous; to the Anakim in Hebron, whom the spies feared in the book of Numbers; to the lingering remnants in Gaza, Ashdod, and Gath after Joshua's campaigns. Giants were not mythic exaggerations floating in isolated tales. They were embedded in Israel's geographic memory, and Scripture does not erase them neatly. Now consider the scene in 2 Samuel 21. David is older. The text says he grew weary in battle. Ishbi-benob, another giant from Gath, nearly kills him. It is Abishai, son of Zeruiah, who intervenes and saves the king. This detail is sobering. The champion of Elah, once young and running toward danger, is now vulnerable. Age changes the battlefield. The men of David swear that he will no longer go out with them to fight, lest you quench the lamp of Israel. Lamp, that word carries weight. The king is seen as light for the nation. His survival matters symbolically, but here is the shift. David does not defeat every giant personally. Others step in. Sibbecai kills Saph. Elhanan kills Lami, the brother of Goliath. Jonathan, son of Shimei, kills the 6-fingered warrior. The victories continue, but they are distributed. The narrative expands beyond a single hero. This is the 4th major pivot in the larger story. The giant problem is not solved by one act of courage. It requires a community shaped by the same trust. David's initial victory becomes pattern for others. The shepherd who stepped into the middle has trained men who will do the same. Now step back and consider the textual complexity. In 1 Samuel 17, David kills Goliath. In 2 Samuel 21, the text says Elhanan killed Lami, the brother of Goliath the Gittite. But in 1 Chronicles 20, the chronicler clarifies explicitly that it was the brother of Goliath, not Goliath himself. This small variation sparked centuries of discussion. Skeptics have pointed to it as contradiction. Jewish scholars long before modern critics addressed it as scribal clarification or textual compression. The chronicler, writing later, often streamlined earlier narratives to remove ambiguity. The core point remains consistent: Goliath died at Elah, but his family did not vanish. The preservation of these names matters. Scripture does not sanitize history into neat endings. It preserves tension. Giants fall, giants return, and new generations must face them. Now widen the scale further. The Valley of Rephaim, southwest of Jerusalem, becomes a recurring battleground in David's reign. The Philistines gather there more than once. The name itself, Rephaim, echoes the ancient giant clans. Geography remembers. Names carry memory. Even after Jerusalem is captured and established as capital, even after the ark is brought up to Zion with singing and dancing, even after David consolidates the tribes under one throne, the threat lingers on the edges. This tells us something profound. Spiritual and cultural threats rarely disappear with one decisive moment. They adapt. They re-emerge. They test each generation. And here the theological layer deepens. In Genesis 6, there is that strange passage about the Nephilim, mighty men of old. It appears briefly before the flood narrative. Jewish tradition wrestled with it extensively. Some Second Temple writings, like 1 Enoch, expanded it into elaborate stories about rebellious heavenly beings. The canonical text of Genesis remains restrained, but the memory of mighty men and unusual figures lingers in Israel's imagination. When Jude and 2 Peter later refer to angels who did not keep their proper domain into ancient judgment, they draw from that reservoir of memory. The point is not mythic fascination. It is warning. Rebellion against divine order distorts creation. Giants in Scripture are not just tall men. They represent disproportion, power unbounded, pride unrestrained. When David's men killed the later giants of Gath, the text closes with a simple line. These 4 were descended from the giants in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants. Notice that phrase, by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants. Elah was never meant to produce a lone legend. It was meant to shape a generation. And that is how giants are finally defeated, not by a single stone, but by a culture that refuses to fear height more than it trusts covenant. But even that victory is not ultimate, because later Babylon will rise. Later Rome will rise. Empires larger than Philistia will dominate Israel. The giant motif evolves, and the question returns in every era, who will stand in the middle now? The story of Gath did not end with one body in a valley. It stretched across decades. And it still whispers across history. By the time the later giants appear in 2 Samuel, Israel is no longer a loose tribal confederation trembling on a hillside. Jerusalem has fallen to David. The Jebusite stronghold, once considered impregnable, has become Zion, the city of David. The Ark of the Covenant has been brought there with singing, with sacrifice, with trembling joy. Psalm 24 may echo that moment. Lift up your heads, O gates, that the King of glory may come in. The political center has shifted. The spiritual center has shifted. David has established alliances with Hiram of Tyre. Cedar from Lebanon strengthens palace and city. Borders expand. Moab subdued. Edom brought under control. Aram pushed back. On the surface, Israel looks stable, and that is when the giants return. There is a quiet warning embedded in that pattern. Threat does not always strike when you are weakest. Sometimes it waits until you are confident. The Valley of Rephaim becomes a battlefield more than once during David's reign. The Philistines spread out there, probing toward Jerusalem. David inquires of the Lord before engaging them. That detail matters. Even as king, even after years of victory, David still asks before acting. In one battle, he is told to attack directly. In another, he is told to circle around and wait for the sound of marching in the tops of the balsam trees. Imagine that moment. An army waiting in silence, listening for wind moving through leaves. Victory does not come by instinct alone. It comes by attention. This discipline distinguishes David from Saul. Saul acted prematurely at Gilgal. David pauses at Rephaim. The difference is subtle, but it shapes outcomes. Now return to the aging king facing Ishbi-Benob. The text says David grew weary. That line feels almost humanly tender. The man who once ran toward Goliath now tires in battle. Time humbles everyone. Abishai saves him, and the men insist he stay back next time, lest you quench the lamp of Israel. That phrase deserves attention. Lamp. In the ancient Near East, a lamp symbolized life, continuity, dynasty. In 1 Kings, the Lord promises David that he will always have a lamp in Jerusalem, a descendant on the throne. The survival of the king is tied to covenant promise, but here is the deeper layer. David is no longer the only one capable of slaying giants. Sibbecai strikes Saph. Elhanan strikes Lami. Jonathan strikes the 6-fingered warrior. The pattern has multiplied. Allah created culture. David's courage became communal courage. This is how transformation endures, not through spectacle, through imitation. Now consider the textual preservation of these names. Ishbi-Benob, Saph, Lami. These are not legendary titles. They are specific, rooted in Gath, linked to ancestry. Scripture refuses to reduce giants to metaphor alone. It anchors them in geography and lineage. This grounding matters because it prevents romanticizing the struggle. Israel faced real threats from real enemies. Yet those enemies carried symbolic weight beyond their size. They were remnants of earlier fears. Unfinished business from Joshua's generation. The fact that giants appear again reminds us of something difficult. Victory does not erase history, it confronts it, but history resurfaces. The conquest narratives in Joshua speak of driving out Anakim from Hebron and surrounding hill country, yet leaving some in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. That incomplete removal created lingering tension. And Scripture does not hide that tension. It preserves it. There is honesty here. The Bible does not present Israel's story as uninterrupted triumph. It presents it as struggle layered across generations, now widened further. In Psalm 18, David reflects on deliverance from enemies. He speaks of God training his hands for war, enabling him to bend a bow of bronze. He describes enemies fleeing before him. These psalms likely draw from years that included battles against Philistines and their remaining giants. But the tone is not self-glorifying. It is grateful. He sees himself as recipient, not source. Contrast that with Goliath's stance in Elah. Goliath trusted his own stature. David attributes victory to the Lord. That theological difference echoes across time. When Babylon rises under Nebuchadnezzar, boasting in its might, the prophet Daniel will later interpret dreams that show kingdoms as statues, grand, impressive, but vulnerable to a single stone cut without human hands. A stone again, striking at the feet of a towering image. The motif resurfaces in apocalyptic form. The book of Revelation, centuries later, portrays beasts rising from sea and land, empires with terrifying presence, yet they too fall. The giant motif evolves from physical stature to imperial arrogance. Gath becomes Babylon. Babylon becomes Rome. The pattern persists. Giants are any force that stands in defiance of covenant order, and each generation must decide how to confront them. David's generation learned to stand. His men learned to stand. The culture shifted from paralysis to participation, but the story remains unfinished, because even David's reign will falter. He will number the people in pride. He will commit adultery. He will face rebellion from his own son Absalom. The giant outside is only one dimension. The giant within is another. Yet in this moment, after Elah, after wilderness, after Jerusalem, the text pauses to record that the descendants of the giants fell by the hand of David and his servants. It is quiet triumph, not dramatic, not poetic, simply stated, and that simplicity carries weight. The unfinished business of Gath did not control Israel's future, but it had to be faced repeatedly. And that may be the deepest lesson. One stone is not enough for a lifetime. Courage must be renewed. Trust must be relearned. The giants after Goliath prove that victory is not an event. It is a posture sustained across years. And as David's reign matures, another layer begins to form, one that will stretch far beyond Philistia, far beyond Jerusalem into prophetic hope. Because the line of David is about to become more than a royal dynasty. It will become promise. By the time the last of Gath's giants fall, David's kingdom is no longer fragile. Jerusalem stands secured. The ark rests within the city. The surrounding nations, Moab, Edom, parts of Aram, have felt Israel's strength. Trade routes open. Administration stabilizes. For the first time since Joshua, Israel resembles a unified nation with defined borders. And yet the text preserves those final giant encounters almost quietly. No long speeches, no dramatic buildup, just names, battles, outcomes. It is as if Scripture is telling us something subtle. The first giant was terrifying because Israel did not yet know who they were. The later giants were formidable but not paralyzing. Identity had changed. David's early victory at Elah had done more than eliminate a threat. It reshaped national imagination. Now Israel did not look at height and immediately assume defeat. They had memory. Memory is power. And here is where the narrative stretches into something larger than Philistia. The promise to David in 2 Samuel 7 becomes central. Prophet Nathan comes to the king after he expresses desire to build a house for the Lord. Instead, God makes a promise to David. I will make you a house, a dynasty. I will raise up your offspring after you, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. Forever. That word widens the story beyond a single reign, beyond Goliath, beyond even Jerusalem. The covenant with David reframes kingship itself. The king is no longer merely military leader. He becomes bearer of promise. The giant narrative now folds into messianic expectation. Because if David's line endures forever, then the final victory over all defiant powers must also endure. But history complicates that hope. After David, Solomon reigns in glory. The temple rises in Jerusalem, cedar and gold, priests and sacrifice, cloud filling the sanctuary. The city becomes spiritual center not just for Israel but for pilgrims from surrounding nations. Yet even in Solomon's reign, cracks appear. Forces multiplied from Egypt, foreign alliances secured through marriage, wealth accumulated. The temptation of visible strength returns. After Solomon, the kingdom divides north and south. Samaria and Jerusalem, Jeroboam and Rehoboam, and giants take new shapes. Assyria rises under Tiglath-Pileser III. Samaria falls. The northern tribes scatter. Babylon rises under Nebuchadnezzar. Jerusalem burns. The temple is destroyed. The sons of David are led in chains. The lamp seems extinguished. Where is the covenant now? Where is the promise of forever? The prophets speak into that darkness. Isaiah speaks of a shoot from the stump of Jesse, stump, not towering tree, a remnant image. Micah speaks again of Bethlehem. From you shall come forth one whose coming forth is from of old. Bethlehem returns to the center, the overlooked town, the same soil where David once tended sheep, the same lineage that once faced Goliath. The hope narrows and intensifies. The giant motif has expanded from Philistine champions to imperial empires. Babylon becomes a towering statue in Daniel's vision, head of gold, chest of silver, legs of iron, iron again. But a stone cut without human hands strikes the statue at its feet and shatters it. A stone. The imagery is not accidental. The stone that once felled a giant now becomes symbol of divine kingdom overthrowing human empires. The pattern matures. And when the New Testament opens with a genealogy in Matthew, Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham, it is not nostalgia, it is claim. The line has survived exile. The lamp still burns. Bethlehem becomes birthplace again, this time under Roman occupation. Another empire, another giant. Rome's legions, like Philistine iron, dominate through technology and discipline. Crucifixion lines the roads. Governors like Pontius Pilate enforce order ruthlessly. And into that world steps another son of David. He does not carry a sling. He carries no sword. He speaks of a kingdom not of this world. He stands in the middle again, between accusers and accused, between heaven and earth. At Golgotha, a name meaning place of the skull, he is lifted up. The imagery is haunting. At Elah, a giant's skull was crushed. At Golgotha, the son of David's skull is pierced. The direction reverses, and yet the theology deepens. In the valley, David fought on behalf of Israel. At the cross, Jesus is described in the New Testament as fighting on behalf of humanity itself, against sin, against death. Paul will later write of principalities and powers defeated openly. The language shifts from physical giants to spiritual dominions, but the pattern remains. One stands in the middle. One bears the risk. One victory becomes many. The giants after Goliath were real men from Gath, but they were also reminders. History repeats defiance, and God repeatedly raises deliverers. The final deliverer, according to Christian confession, is not just son of Jesse, he is Lord, and that reframes the entire story. Goliath was not the ultimate enemy. Philistia was not the ultimate threat. The valley was rehearsal. The real confrontation was always larger, and yet it began with a shepherd who refused to measure strength by height. The giants after Goliath confirmed something profound. Victory must be renewed. Trust must be sustained. Promise must be remembered, because giants evolve, but so does hope. After the dust of Elah settled and the later giants from Gath fell in their turn, something quieter began to happen. The story started to change shape. It moved from battlefield memory into national identity. David was no longer just the shepherd who defeated Goliath. He was king in Jerusalem. He captured the city from the Jebusites, ascending through its water shaft, turning a fortified stronghold into Zion. He brought the Ark of the Covenant there from Kiriath-Jearim, dancing before it with abandon. He established Jerusalem not just as political capital, but as spiritual center. And with that shift, the story of the giant entered Israel's liturgy. Memory became song. Many of the psalms attributed to David carry echoes of Elah without naming it directly. Psalm 18 speaks of God delivering him from enemies stronger than he. Psalm 144 describes the Lord as the one who trains his hands for war and his fingers for battle. Psalm 27 declares, "Though an army encamp against me, my heart shall not fear." These are not abstract lines. They are shaped by lived experience. When Israel sang these psalms at festivals, at Passover, at the Feast of Tabernacles, the memory of divine deliverance was renewed collectively. The giant became part of national imagination, but something else happened. The story risked becoming legend. Whenever a nation retells its victories, there is temptation to polish them, to exaggerate, to turn men into mythic figures. Yet the biblical text resists that impulse. It records David's failures alongside his triumphs, the adultery with Bathsheba, the murder of Uriah the Hittite, the rebuke from Nathan, the rebellion of Absalom, the census that brought plague upon Israel. If this were simple propaganda, those details would vanish. But they remain. That honesty keeps the Goliath story grounded. David is not superhuman. He is chosen, flawed, restored. This tension is critical for understanding monarchy in Israel. In the surrounding nations, Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, kings were often portrayed as semi-divine. Their inscriptions rarely mentioned failure. Reliefs carved in stone presented them as invincible, crushing enemies effortlessly. Israel's monarchy is different. The king is under covenant. He is rebuked by prophets. He is accountable to Torah. The Book of Kings later evaluates rulers not by military expansion but by faithfulness to the Lord. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, or he did what was evil. That phrase becomes the measuring rod, not size of army, not size of treasury. The story of Goliath fits into that framework. It is not celebrated because David was bold. It is celebrated because he trusted rightly. Now consider how the chronicler, writing centuries later after the exile, retells Israel's history. In 1 Chronicles, the narrative of David emphasizes temple preparation, worship organization, Levitical duties. The focus shifts from battlefield to sanctuary. Yet the memory of Goliath remains in the background, anchoring David's legitimacy. He was not just temple planner, he was deliverer. For post-exilic readers, those who returned from Babylon under Zerubbabel and Ezra, the story of David and Goliath carried new weight. They lived under Persian rule. They did not have an independent king on David's throne. The temple had been rebuilt, but glory seemed diminished compared to Solomon. Reading about a shepherd who defeated a giant would not feel like children's folklore. It would feel like hope. Hope that God could raise strength from smallness again. Now widen the scale. As Israel's story moved into the Hellenistic period after Alexander the Great, and later under Roman occupation, the Davidic memory intensified. Jewish groups debated the nature of the coming Messiah. Some expected a warrior king like David, who would overthrow foreign powers decisively. Others envisioned a more priestly or prophetic figure. The story of Elah fed those expectations. A son of David who stands in the middle and defeats the oppressor. But there was risk here. If the memory hardened into simplistic nationalism, it could distort the original lesson. Because David did not defeat Goliath through brute force. He defeated him through trust aligned with covenant. The monarchy in Israel was never meant to replace God as source of security. It was meant to reflect divine justice. When kings forgot that, like Ahab in Samaria or Manasseh in Jerusalem, the prophets rose to confront them. Elijah on Mount Carmel stood against the prophets of Baal in a confrontation that echoed Allah in tone. One man against many, fire from heaven, public exposure of false confidence. The pattern repeats. The story of Goliath becomes part of a larger narrative of confrontation between covenant faithfulness and defiant power. But over time, as memory layers upon memory, the line between history and symbol can blur. This is where careful reading matters. Goliath was real. Gath was real. The Valley of Elah can still be walked today. Yet the story also functions as archetype, not myth detached from reality, but history that carries pattern. Memory becomes both anchor and warning. And as Israel's monarchy matures and eventually fractures, the question returns with urgency. Will the throne remember Allah, or will it begin to trust its own iron? When Solomon sat on David's throne in Jerusalem, the memory of Allah was no longer fresh. It had already become inheritance. Solomon inherited a kingdom secured by battles he did not fight. The Philistines were subdued. The borders stretched from the river Euphrates down toward Egypt's frontier. Trade agreements flourished. Silver became as common as stone in Jerusalem, according to the account in 1 Kings. The temple rose on Mount Moriah, cedar from Lebanon, gold overlaying walls, carved cherubim stretching their wings over the inner sanctuary, priests in linen, trumpets sounding. It was magnificent. And here lies the danger. When visible glory increases, memory can fade. The king who once refused armor had built a palace of cedar. The son who inherited the throne multiplied horses from Egypt, even though Deuteronomy warned kings not to multiply horses. He accumulated wives from surrounding nations, Moabites, Ammonites, Sidonians, despite covenant caution. The shift was gradual. No valley confrontation, no towering giant. Just small compromises layered over years. The monarchy began to resemble the nations it once stood apart from. Now pause and consider the irony. Israel once asked for a king like the nations. God gave them Saul. Saul's fragility exposed the weakness of appearance-based leadership. David reshaped the throne through covenant trust. Solomon, in his wisdom, begins to drift back toward the model of surrounding empires. The lesson of Allah is not erased, it is overshadowed, and the prophets will soon begin to speak more urgently. After Solomon's death, the kingdom divides. Jeroboam establishes rival worship centers in Bethel and Dan, setting up golden calves. Rehoboam, ruling in Jerusalem, hardens his heart and fractures national unity. The monarchy no longer stands unified under one son of David. The north forms its own identity. The south clings to Jerusalem and the temple, and in both regions kings rise and fall. The author of Kings evaluates them not by military success, but by faithfulness. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. Again and again, the memory of Allah should have reminded them that trust in visible systems is fragile, yet they return to alliances with Assyria. They rely on Egypt. They negotiate with Babylon. In Isaiah's time, King Ahaz faces pressure from Aram and Israel. Instead of trusting in the Lord, he appeals to Assyria for help. Isaiah rebukes him and speaks of a child to be born, a sign of divine presence. That prophecy echoes forward. But in the moment, the monarchy chooses the spear over the sling. Jeremiah later stands in Jerusalem warning of Babylon's coming destruction. He speaks in the temple courtyard, calling the people to repentance. The people trust in the temple's presence itself, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, as if architecture guarantees security. This is the same illusion that once paralyzed Israel before Goliath, visible strength mistaken for ultimate protection. And Babylon comes. Nebuchadnezzar's armies breach Jerusalem's walls. The temple burns. The sons of David are killed before the eyes of Zedekiah. The king is blinded and led in chains to Babylon. The lamp flickers. The throne is empty. From a political perspective, the Davidic promise appears shattered, but memory survives exile. In Babylon, prophets like Ezekiel and Daniel keep hope alive. Daniel interprets Nebuchadnezzar's dream of a towering statue, head of gold, chest of silver, legs of iron, feet of iron and clay. iron again. The statue represents empires, but a stone cut without human hands strikes the image at its feet and shatters it. A stone. The imagery would not be lost on readers who knew Allah. Empires may tower, iron may dominate, but stone can undo what seems permanent. This is not nostalgia. It is theology layered through history, now widened further. When Persian King Cyrus conquers Babylon and allows Jewish exiles to return, Jerusalem is rebuilt slowly. The Second Temple stands, smaller than Solomon. There is no independent king from David's line on the throne, yet genealogies are preserved, lineage guarded, the promise remembered. The story of David and Goliath is not abandoned. It becomes part of a larger hope, a son of David who will not merely defeat a Philistine champion but restore covenant faithfulness permanently. In the intertestamental period, Jewish writings reflect intense longing for that figure. Some envision a warrior like Judas Maccabeus who fights Seleucid oppression. Others imagine a righteous king who purifies temple worship. The memory of Allah feeds these expectations, but history complicates them. Rome rises. Legions march across Judea. Herod, an Idumean installed by Rome, sits on David's throne. The irony is thick. The throne of the shepherd king occupied by a client ruler of empire. And into that world the Gospel of Matthew opens with a genealogy. Jesus Christ, the son of David. It is not ornamental, it is claim. Memory converges, Bethlehem returns. And the question deepens, what kind of giant will this son of David face? The monarchy had drifted. The temple had been destroyed and rebuilt. Empires had risen and fallen. But the story of Allah still whispered, trust in the name. Do not fear the height. And now the narrative is about to stretch beyond monarchy into something even more expansive, because the final confrontation will not take place in a valley between two ridges. It will take place on a hill outside a city wall, and the shape of victory will look very different. But to understand it, we must first understand how memory turned into expectation, and how expectation can both clarify and distort hope. The sling and the spear still stand before every generation. But the battlefield is widening, and the throne is about to be redefined. By the time Rome tightened its grip around Judea, the memory of David had become more than history. It had become longing. In villages like Nazareth and towns like Capernaum, people still recited the Psalms. They still sang of Zion. They still remembered the shepherd who became king and the giant who fell in the Valley of Elah. But now they lived under Caesar. Roman standards lined the roads. Tax collectors worked for empire. Crucifixions were not rare. The iron of Philistia had become the iron of Rome, disciplined, efficient, merciless. And in this world the hope for a son of David sharpened. When blind men cried out in the gospel accounts, "Son of David, have mercy on us," they were not merely using a title of respect. They were invoking promise. The covenant made in 2 Samuel 7 had never been formally revoked. The prophets had spoken of restoration. Isaiah described a ruler who would sit on David's throne with justice and righteousness. Jeremiah promised a righteous branch. Ezekiel envisioned a shepherd who would feed the flock rightly, shepherd again. The image returns, but here is the tension. Many expected a warrior king like David, someone who would confront Rome as David confronted Goliath. The pattern seemed obvious. Oppressor stands in the valley. Anointed one steps forward. Victory follows. Yet when Jesus of Nazareth enters Jerusalem riding on a donkey, quoting Zechariah's prophecy of a humble king, the symbolism shifts. He does not arrive on a war horse. He cleanses the temple. He speaks of a kingdom not of this world. He confronts Pharisees and Sadducees not with swords but with parables. The giant motif begins to transform. The enemy is no longer merely external empire. It is sin. It is corruption of the heart. It is hypocrisy within covenant community. This is another pivot. In the Valley of Elah, David defeated a visible giant. In 1st century Jerusalem, the greater confrontation is invisible: pride, self-righteousness, fear of losing control. The same forces that destabilized Saul. And then comes Golgotha, the place of the skull, Outside Jerusalem's walls, the Son of David hangs on a Roman cross. From a distance it looks like defeat. Rome stands. Iron nails hold him in place. The crowd mocks. Save yourself. The echo is chillingly familiar. At Elah, Goliath mocked Israel's inability to send a champion. At Golgotha, onlookers mocked the Anointed One's refusal to descend from the cross. But the direction of victory is reversed. David struck a giant down. Jesus allows himself to be struck. The New Testament writers interpret this not as failure but as deeper triumph. Paul writes in Colossians that God disarmed rulers and authorities, triumphing over them in the cross. The language is military. Yet the weapon is suffering love. This reframes everything. The story of Goliath prepared Israel to understand representative victory. One stands in the middle. One acts on behalf of many. But Golgotha stretches that pattern beyond battlefield into cosmic scale. The enemy is not merely Philistine arrogance. It is death itself. And the resurrection becomes the ultimate reversal. If Allah restored Israel's courage temporarily, the resurrection claims to restore humanity's hope permanently. Now step back. The monarchy began with Saul's insecurity. It matured under David's trust. It fractured under Solomon's compromise. It collapsed under Babylon. It survived in promise. And in the New Testament it is fulfilled, not through political domination, but through redefined kingship. The book of Revelation closes Scripture with imagery of a rider on a white horse called Faithful and True. He judges and makes war in righteousness. The language feels like Davidic victory elevated to apocalyptic scale. But this rider bears a name known only to himself. His robe is dipped in blood, his own before it is anyone else. The giant motif completes its arc, from Gath to Jerusalem to Golgotha to a renewed creation. Memory became monarchy, monarchy became exile, exile became expectation, expectation became incarnation, and the shepherd's story expands into something eternal. Yet the lesson of Allah remains close to the ground. It still whispers to every generation tempted to trust iron more than promise. The sling and the spear, the valley and the hill, the visible and the unseen. The story of Goliath is not just preserved as ancient triumph, it is preserved as warning and as invitation, because every age builds its own giants, and every heart must decide where it places its trust. Stand again in the Valley of Elah. Now let the scene widen in your mind. Two ridges. A man in the middle, two armies watching. That pattern, one standing between many, did not begin there, and it did not end there. From the earliest pages of Genesis, the idea of representation shapes the story. Adam stands in a garden not merely as an individual but as head of humanity. His failure ripples outward. Exile follows. Later, Abraham stands before God pleading for Sodom. Moses stands between God and Israel after the golden calf, offering himself in intercession. "Blot me out of your book," he says, "if the people cannot be forgiven." One man between judgment and many lives. Allah fits that pattern. Goliath offers representation on Philistine's terms. "If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants." Victory or servitude determined by one outcome. David accepts the terms, but reframes the battle. He stands not as an isolated hero, but as covenant representative. That all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. The scope widens from tribal survival to divine revelation. Now move forward in time. Jerusalem under Roman occupation is another kind of valley. Power is concentrated. Pilate holds authority. Herod maneuvers politically. The Sanhedrin guards religious legitimacy. And into that tension walks Jesus of Nazareth. The Gospels present him deliberately as son of David. In Matthew, the genealogy begins with Abraham and centers on David before moving forward. In Luke, the genealogy moves backward through David to Adam. The link is intentional. This is not random rabbi from Galilee. This is heir of promise, yet his confrontation does not resemble Allah at first glance. He does not challenge Rome to single combat. He does not assemble an army in the Valley of Rephaim. Instead, he confronts illness, forgives sins, overturns tables in the temple, speaks of inner purity. The giants shift. blindness, hypocrisy, fear, oppression of the poor. In Mark's Gospel, when Jesus forgives a paralytic's sins, the scribes accuse him of blasphemy. They understand the claim. Forgiveness belongs to God. The battle is theological. At Caesarea Philippi, a city named for Caesar and Philip, Peter confesses Jesus as the Christ, the Anointed One. The location matters. Pagan temples carved into rock, imperial presence looming. Jesus speaks there of building his assembly on a rock. Rock again. Stone imagery threads through Scripture. At Elah, a stone struck a giant. In Daniel's vision, a stone shatters an empire. In the Gospels, Jesus quotes Psalm 118, "The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone." Rejected, yet foundational, the language is layered. Now pause and consider something unsettling. In the Valley of Elah, David's victory was immediate and visible. Goliath fell. The enemy fled. At Golgotha, the son of David hangs and dies. From a purely visible standpoint, Rome wins. The cross was designed for humiliation, public, brutal, final. Yet the New Testament writers insist that something deeper happened there. Paul in 1 Corinthians speaks of the cross as foolishness to Greeks and weakness to Jews, yet the power of God to those who are being saved. Power hidden inside weakness. This reverses the Elah pattern outwardly, but fulfills it inwardly. At Elah, Israel's fear collapsed when the giant fell. At Golgotha, the deeper enemy, sin and death, are confronted through surrender. Hebrews describes Jesus as high priest entering once for all into the holy places, securing eternal redemption. Representation again, one entering on behalf of many. The language is covenantal. In Romans, Paul explicitly compares Adam and Christ. As by one man's disobedience many were made sinners, so by the one man's obedience many will be made righteous. The structure mirrors Elah. One stands in the middle. One act shapes many. But here the battlefield is not geographical. It is cosmic, principalities and powers, death itself. This is the escalation of scale, from shepherd versus giant, to king versus empire, to Messiah versus death. The gospel narratives frame the crucifixion in language that echoes Psalm 22, a psalm attributed to David. My God, why have you forsaken me?" The psalm begins in anguish but ends in vindication, proclaiming that all the ends of the earth shall remember and turn to the Lord, all the earth. David used that phrase before facing Goliath. Now it appears again at the cross. The line from Elah to Golgotha is not forced, it is patterned. In both scenes, an anointed son of David stands exposed before enemies. In both, mockery fills the air. In both, the outcome reshapes the identity of those watching. But at Golgotha, the victory is hidden for 3 days. No immediate surge of troops, no pursuing army, just silence, then resurrection. And if that claim is true, then the greatest giant, death, has fallen, not by sling but by sacrifice. The story that began in a valley now stretches beyond history itself, and the question shifts again. If one has stood in the middle for humanity, what does that mean for those who follow? Because representation invites response. Elah called Israel to remember. Golgotha calls humanity to trust. And the scale has never been larger, but we are not finished. Because the final vision of Scripture does not end at an empty tomb. It moves toward a renewed creation where no giant stands defiant again. And to see that clearly, we must look at how the story closes, from valley to cross to throne. After the resurrection, the language of kingship changes again. Jesus does not seize Rome's throne. He does not march on the Antonia fortress. Instead, he speaks to his disciples on a mountain in Galilee and says, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me." All authority, that is imperial language, but it is not tied to a city like Jerusalem or Rome. It is cosmic. The scale widens beyond anything imagined in the Valley of Elah. At Elah, the stakes were Israel's survival against Philistine pressure. At Golgotha, the stakes were humanity's bondage to sin and death. After the resurrection, the claim stretches to heaven and earth. The battlefield is no longer geographic. It is universal. The early followers of Jesus understood this in startling ways. In the book of Acts, when Peter and John stand before the Sanhedrin, the same council that condemned Jesus, they speak with calm boldness. They quote Psalm 118 again. "The stone that was rejected by you, the builders, has become the cornerstone." They are speaking in Jerusalem, within sight of the temple, in the shadow of Rome, and they are declaring that the rejected son of David is now foundation of something unshakable. This is the fifth major pivot in the story. The giant motif shifts from physical dominance to ideological and spiritual opposition. When Paul travels through cities like Ephesus, Corinth, and Rome, he does not face towering warriors. He faces systems, idolatry, economic networks built around pagan temples, philosophies shaped by empire. In Ephesus, when the silversmiths riot because their trade in Artemis shrines is threatened, it is not about size, it is about allegiance. Which kingdom will define reality? Paul writes in Ephesians about putting on the whole armor of God, belt of truth, breastplate of righteousness, shield of faith, helmet of salvation, sword of the Spirit. The imagery echoes warfare. But the enemies are described as rulers, authorities, cosmic powers over this present darkness. The language of giants has matured into language of spiritual dominion. The lesson of Allah persists. Do not measure strength only by what can be seen. Now step further forward. The book of Revelation closes the canon with imagery that feels enormous. Beasts rise from sea and land. They wield power over nations. They demand allegiance. They persecute those who refuse to bow. These beasts are not 9-foot warriors. They are empires personified. Rome in John's day. Any empire in any day that demands ultimate loyalty. And how are they defeated? Not by a political coup, not by visible military overthrow, but by the Lamb who was slain. The paradox deepens. The shepherd who became king finds fulfillment in a king who becomes lamb, power through surrender, victory through sacrifice. In Revelation 5, John sees a scroll sealed with 7 seals. No one is worthy to open it. He weeps until he hears of the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David. Lion. Strength, expectation. But when he turns, he sees a lamb standing as though slain. The image fuses Davidic kingship with sacrificial vulnerability. This is the ultimate reframing of strength. Goliath trusted iron, Saul trusted appearance. Empires trust force, but the lamb triumphs through faithfulness unto death. Now pause for a moment. Think about the ark. Gath's champion steps into a valley and defies the armies of Israel. A shepherd steps forward and defeats him with a stone. Generations later, another son of David stands before empire and is executed. 3 days later, he rises. Centuries later, believers scattered across Rome's territories refuse to burn incense to Caesar, even at the cost of their lives. They believe the real giant has already fallen. Death. The story that began as local confrontation becomes global proclamation. And yet the pattern returns in every age. The giant is never only physical. It is pride. It is domination. It is systems that dehumanize. It is fear that paralyzes. The gospel writers frame Jesus as fulfilling the Davidic line not to revive nationalism but to redefine kingship itself. My kingdom is not of this world, he says to Pilate. Not of this world does not mean absent from it. It means not sourced from its weapons. The sling and the spear reappear in metaphor, trust and control, faith and fear. The battle continues, but not in the way ancient watchers in Allah might have imagined. The valley was rehearsal, the cross was culmination, the resurrection was declaration, and the throne, according to Revelation, is eternal. But there is still one final movement left in this story, because even with resurrection proclaimed, giants still appear in history, empires still rise, nations still trust in iron. So what does the story of Goliath mean now? Not in ancient Israel, not only in 1st century Judea, but in every generation that faces its own towering threats. To answer that, we must bring the story home, from Gath to Jerusalem to the present, and ask what kind of giants we are still standing before. History did not end with Rome, it never does. Empires fell, Others rose: Byzantium, the caliphates, medieval kingdoms, colonial powers, modern superstates with nuclear arsenals and digital surveillance. The scale of iron changed, but the temptation remained. Trust what looks unstoppable, fear what stands taller. The story of Goliath can easily be reduced to personal motivation. Face your fears, believe in yourself, but that shrinks it. Allah was never about self-confidence. It was about covenant alignment. And Golgotha was never about heroic martyrdom alone. It was about redemptive representation. The deeper question is not, what is your giant? The deeper question is, where do you place your trust when the giant speaks? Because giants always speak. They speak through headlines, through market crashes, through cultural pressure, through political threats, through personal failure. They tell you what is inevitable. They define the terms. Choose a man for yourselves. Bow to the system. Protect yourself first. And fear spreads quietly. Saul's story warns us what happens when leadership is shaped by fear of losing control. He began well. He rallied Israel, but insecurity hollowed him. He tried to manage perception. He tried to eliminate perceived threats. He clung to power. And in doing so, he lost it. David's story warns us of something else. Victory does not eliminate temptation. The shepherd who trusted deeply could still fall gravely. Bathsheba's rooftop, Uriah's death, Absalom's rebellion, the sword never fully left his house. Even covenant-aligned leaders remain fragile, so where does that leave us? The final vision in Revelation does not end with endless battle. It ends with a city, a new Jerusalem, not captured by force, descending from heaven. Its gates open. No temple inside it because the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb are its temple. No need of sun or moon because glory fills it. And there is no more death, the last giant gone. That is the ultimate escalation of scale, from one valley in Judah to the renewal of all creation. The Bible does not present this as myth detached from history. It presents it as trajectory. The same God who worked in Bethlehem's fields and Jerusalem's courts intends to finish what began in promise. Now imagine standing again in the Valley of Elah today. Tourists walk the trails. The brook still runs in rainy season. The ridges remain. It feels small, not epic, just land. And yet that ordinary valley carried a confrontation that shaped millennia because it revealed a pattern. Power that relies solely on itself collapses eventually. Trust anchored beyond visible strength endures. The Philistines trusted iron monopoly. Assyria trusted chariots. Babylon trusted walls. Rome trusted legions. Modern nations trust technology and deterrence. Individuals trust reputation and control. The story keeps repeating. The sling and the spear, the valley and the cross, the visible and the unseen. Every generation must decide what kind of story it will inhabit. Will it measure security by height or by covenant? Will it respond to taunts with fear or with memory? The story of Goliath survives not because giants are impressive, but because trust is rare. And trust, once embodied, changes history. From Elah to Golgotha, from shepherd to Messiah, the line is clear. One stands in the middle, one bears the risk, one victory becomes many. And in the end, the giant falls not because of human scale, but because of divine faithfulness. But the story does not end in abstraction. It ends in invitation. The valley is always before us. The question is always present. When the voice calls out, when the threat seems larger than life, when the system feels immovable, who will you believe, the spear or the name? By the time we reach the end of the story, the giant is no longer standing in a valley. He is standing inside civilizations. Goliath of Gath was visible, measurable. His height could be recorded, his armor weighed, his spear described in detail. But the giants that followed became harder to see. Babylon did not look like a man. It looked like walls thick enough to withstand siege. It looked like hanging gardens and gold-plated temples. It looked permanent. Rome did not look like a single champion. It looked like roads stretching across continents, legions marching in formation, law codified and enforced. Modern giants do not wear bronze helmets. They wear ideology. They wear economic systems. They wear cultural narratives that define success and power. And they still speak. They still say, choose for yourselves. They still reduce reality to human scale. The prophet Daniel understood this in Babylon. When he interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dream, he described a statue towering into the sky, head of gold, chest of silver, legs of iron, iron again. But the iron could not save it from a stone cut without human hands. The stone did not look impressive, but it struck at the foundation. This is the pattern. Giants rely on visible strength. God undermines foundations. Now consider Revelation again. The beasts rising from sea and land are grotesque, exaggerated images of empire. They demand allegiance. They mark foreheads and hands. They promise security in exchange for worship. It is Allah in apocalyptic form, the voice of defiance now amplified globally. And the response is not to raise a bigger sword. It is to remain faithful. The saints conquer by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. That sounds fragile, until you realize that fear is empire's primary weapon. Remove fear, and the giant loses leverage. This is what happened at Elah. For 40 days, fear froze Israel. One act of trust shattered that paralysis. The giant fell, the army moved, fear shifted sides, now bring it closer. Nations still trust in military dominance. Economies still measure worth by growth alone. Leaders still cling to power out of insecurity. Systems still reward appearance over character. The Saul pattern repeats often. Insecurity masquerading as strength. Jealousy hidden behind authority. Violence justified as necessity. The Goliath pattern repeats too, boast loudly, intimidate relentlessly, define the terms. And yet the David pattern remains available, not naive optimism, not denial of threat, but alignment with something deeper than visible force. The story of Goliath is not anti-strength. It is anti-idolatry of strength. It does not call for passivity. David ran toward the giant, but he ran anchored in covenant, not ego. That difference changes everything. Now pause and imagine standing inside a modern valley. The giant might be a diagnosis, a financial collapse, a cultural tide shifting against conviction, a system that seems too entrenched to challenge. The instinct is the same as Israel's at Elah: retreat, wait for someone else. Let fear set the tone, but the story insists on something else. Remember who you are, remember the name, remember the covenant. For ancient Israel, that covenant was rooted in Sinai and reaffirmed through David. For Christians, it is rooted in the cross and resurrection. For both, the principle holds. Strength detached from righteousness collapses eventually. Empires that demand ultimate allegiance fall. The city of Babylon in Revelation burns. The New Jerusalem descends. The final image of Scripture is not a battlefield. It is a city where tears are wiped away. No more death, no more mourning, no more pain. The last giant gone. But that future does not excuse the present. It informs it. The question is not whether giants exist. They do. The question is what defines your response. Gath raised its champion with pride. Israel raised a shepherd with memory. Rome raised crosses. God raised a son. And the world has been living in the tension between those patterns ever since. The giant within the nations is not just external threat. It is the human impulse to trust what can be seen above what has been promised. The Valley of Elah exposed that impulse. Golgotha redefined it. The final chapters of history will resolve it. But for now, we stand between ridges, listening. The voice still echoes, and the story still asks, who will stand in the middle, and what will they trust?